Hello everyone, and welcome back to Little Nightmare. I'm Michael, and before we begin, I'd like to ask for a little support. Please subscribe, leave a like, and if you do, let me know in the comments where in the world you're listening from. These may seem like small gestures, but they're essential for helping the channel grow and allowing me to keep bringing you these stories every night. Now, lower the volume just a bit, get comfortable, turn off the lights, and let's dive together into tonight's first story. The chair sat in the corner of the room, a silent sentinel of worn velvet and dark, scarred wood. It was not an unusual chair, not in any way that could be easily named, but it held a quality of stillness that felt less like absence and more like waiting. Its high back rose like a dark spine, and the seat cushion, permanently depressed by a weight long gone, cradled a hollow that seemed to swallow the light. Margaret would sit in it for hours, not reading, not sewing, not doing anything at all, just listening to the house breathe and feeling the chair hold her, its velvet arms cool and rough against her skin. Her world was a small, airless thing, bounded by the peeling white fence of their property, and the stern, unyielding love of her mother, Chris. The house was a testament to that love, a clapboard relic smelling of lemon polish and old hymnals, where every surface was clean and every object had its ordained place. Chris believed in order, in the sharp, clean lines of righteousness, and she saw the chaotic, blossoming shape of her daughter as a problem to be solved, a wild vine to be pruned and tied back. Margaret was 17, a quiet girl with hair the color of dust and eyes that were too large for her pale face. She moved through the halls of her high school like a ghost, her shoulders perpetually hunched as if expecting a blow. The blows came, of course. They came from girls with bright laughter and sharp eyes, from boys who smelled of cheap cologne and aggression. They called her Mouse, and the name was a perfect, painful fit. In the cafeteria, they would sometimes flick food at her, little pellets of greasy potato or congealed gravy that would land on her brown cardigan with a soft, wet sound. They would whisper as she passed, a sibilant hiss that followed her down the tiled corridors, a sound that was somehow worse than shouting. She never cried, not where they could see. She would simply absorb it, letting the humiliation sink deep into her bones, where it curdled into something dense and heavy. Her only refuge was the chair. In the deep quiet of the evening, after her mother had finished leading them in prayer, long, suffocating invocations for purity and strength, Margaret would retreat to her room and lower herself into its embrace. And in that chair, the world would sometimes slip. It was not a dramatic thing. It was a subtle softening of the edges, a blurring of the line between the grain of the wood paneling and the air itself. The sound of the furnace kicking on would become a distant, rhythmic heartbeat. The pattern in the velvet would writhe, just at the corner of her vision, like something burrowing beneath the fabric. She would feel a pressure not from the chair, but from something within it, a deep, resonant hum that started in her teeth and traveled down to the marrow of her spine. She thought of it as the silence, though it was filled with a presence more profound than any noise. Her mother saw these absences as a moral failing. "You are drifting, Margaret," Chris would say, her voice a wire brush, scrubbing away at sin. "The devil finds work for idle hands and idle minds. You must be vigilant." Chris' God was a god of rules and wrath, a celestial watchmaker who demanded every gear and spring be perfectly aligned. Margaret's drifting soul was a speck of dust, threatening to jam the entire mechanism. One Tuesday, the humiliation found a new depth. It was in Mr. Davison's history class. She had been trying to make herself small, focusing on the chipped green paint of her desk, when a note, folded into a tight triangle, landed near her elbow. She knew better than to touch it, but her hand, traitorous and hopeful, reached for it anyway. It was from Kyle, a boy with a cruel smile and the eyes of a dead fish. It read in messy scrawl, "Do you even have anything down there, or are you just a doll?" The laughter was a soft, contained wave that broke over the rows of desks. It wasn't loud, but it was everywhere, seeping into her pores. She felt her face go hot, then dangerously cold. The world began to tilt. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed, and the buzz became a voice. 1,000 whispering voices, and the green of the desk seemed to bleed, spreading like a stain across her vision. She felt that familiar pressure building inside her skull, a rising tide of static. She focused on Kyle, on the smug, vacant curve of his mouth. She thought a single simple thing, a void, an absence, a cessation of all that he was. The light above Kyle's desk flickered, not a simple power surge, but a violent, strobing seizure. Then, with a sound like a wet cough, the plastic casing cracked, and the tube exploded in a shower of glass and acrid smoke. Kyle screamed, a high, girlish sound, as shards peppered his arm and the shoulder of his jacket began to smolder. The classroom erupted into chaos, but Margaret just sat, perfectly still, watching the tiny tendrils of smoke curl towards the ceiling. She felt a strange, hollow satisfaction, and beneath it, a cold, bottomless terror. She had done that. The silence had listened. The only person who seemed to see her was George, the elderly janitor. He was a man of few words, his face a road map of wrinkles, his hands gnarled and kind. You would sometimes find her hiding in the library stacks, or sitting alone on a bench behind the gym. He never asked questions. He would simply nod, and once he had given her a single perfect apple from his lunch bag. It was a small, quiet kindness, a pebble dropped into the deep well of her isolation. He smelled of sawdust and soap, a clean, honest smell that was nothing like the cloying sanctity of her home or the sweaty malice of the school. The incident with Kyle was dismissed as faulty wiring, but something had been uncorked in Margaret. The whispers at school grew more vicious, now tinged with a new, superstitious fear. They called her a witch. They said she had the evil eye. Her mother, sensing a new and more dangerous form of waywardness, tightened her grip. The prayers grew longer, the scrutiny more intense. Chris began to speak of a special prayer group, of deliverance, her eyes burning with a frightening fervor. The pressure inside Margaret built with each passing day. It was a physical sensation now, a coiled tension in her gut, a buzzing in her teeth that never fully went away. The world continued to slip at the edges. Walls would breathe. Shadows would congeal into solid, fleeting shapes. The hollow in the velvet chair seemed deeper, darker, as if it were a tunnel leading down into the very foundations of the world. The breaking point came on a rainy Friday. A group of them, led by a girl named Stacy, with a voice like shattering glass, cornered her in the girls' bathroom. They had found one of her drawings, a sketch of the old chair, rendered with such obsessive detail that the velvet looked like a living, breathing landscape. "What's this, freak?" Stacy hissed, holding the paper aloft. "Drawing your throne? You think you're a queen?" They pushed her, their hands sharp and invasive, crowding her against the cold, wet tiles of the wall. Someone snatched her glasses and threw them to the floor. The world became a blur of malicious smiles and gleaming eyes. "Pray," Stacy mocked, her face a distorted moon in Margaret's myopic vision. "Go on, pray to your crazy god. Let's see him save you now." And something in Margaret snapped. It was not a loud break, but a quiet final one, like a single thread giving way and unraveling an entire tapestry. The buzzing in her head rose to a deafening roar, drowning out their taunts. The pressure in her chest expanded, hot and vast. She did not think of voids or absences. She thought of a wave, a great, black, silent wave rising from the deepest part of herself, from the hollow of the chair, from the spaces between atoms. She did not scream. She simply looked at them, her unseeing eyes wide, and let it go. The world did not explode. It dissolved. The fluorescent lights did not just go out. They were swallowed. The sound of the rain on the roof, the drip of a faucet, the girl's breathing. It all vanished, consumed by an absolute crushing silence. The air grew thick, syrupy and cold. Margaret could feel it, a physical tide pouring from her, and in the perfect, lightless black, she could see everything. She saw the fragile architecture of their souls, the petty fears and borrowed cruelties that held them together. And she reached out with the silence and touched them. Stacy was the first. Her mocking mouth was still open, but no sound could escape. Her eyes, wide with a terror so profound, it was almost beautiful, began to cloud over, not with tears, but with a fine, gray dust. Her form seemed to waver, to lose its definition, like a statue of sand being eroded by an unseen wind. She crumbled inward, her substance unraveling into the static-filled dark. The others followed, one by one, their screams trapped forever in the vacuum she had created. They did not die. They were unmade. Their forms dissipated, their memories, their hopes, their petty hatreds, all erased, scattered into the humming, hungry nothing that Margaret had become. The silence lasted for an eternity that was over in a heartbeat. When the world rushed back in, the flickering emergency light, the sound of the fire alarm blaring, the frantic shouts from the hallway, Margaret was alone. The bathroom was pristine. No broken glasses, no scuff marks on the floor, no trace of Stacy or the others. Just a faint, sweet smell of ozone like the air after a lightning strike. The investigation that followed was a circus of confusion. 4 teenagers had vanished from a locked room. There were theories of an elaborate prank, a mass runaway. The police were baffled. The town was gripped with a low-grade hysteria. Through it all, Margaret was the picture of traumatized shock. They asked her questions, and she answered in a soft, hollow voice, saying she saw nothing. She remembered nothing. It was all just a blur. They pitied her. The poor, mousy girl who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Only George, mopping the hallway floor days later, looked at her differently. He did not speak, but his eyes, old and knowing, held hers for a long moment. He saw the shadow clinging to her, the cold emptiness that now lived in her wake. He saw, and he was afraid, not for himself, but for her, and for the world that contained her. At home, her mother saw only a miracle. "God protected you," Chris whispered, clutching Margaret to her bosom, her body trembling with zealous joy. "He swept the wicked from your path. He has marked you, Margaret. He has shown us his purpose." She began to talk of crusades, of testifying, of using this event to spread their message. That night, Margaret sat in the velvet chair. The house was quiet, her mother finally asleep, exhausted by ecstatic prayer. The hollow in the seat felt deeper than ever, a bottomless well. Margaret placed her hands on the arms, feeling the familiar, cool roughness. She could feel the power sleeping inside her, a great dark ocean held behind a fragile dam. It was not a gift. It was a cancer. It was the silence given form, and it was hungry. She had used it out of anger, out of pain, and it had tasted the world. It would want more. She thought of George's fearful eyes. She thought of her mother's fervent, suffocating love, a love that would now try to wield her like a weapon. She thought of the hollow in the chair, and how it was now a part of her, a reflection of the hollow in her own soul. She stood up. She did not pack a bag. She did not write a note. She walked out of her room, down the stairs, and through the front door, leaving it open behind her. The night air was cool and damp. A thin spectral fog clung to the ground. She could feel the vibrations of the sleeping town around her, 1,000 little lives buzzing with their tiny fears and joys. She could, she knew, silence them all. She could make the whole world as quiet as the hollow in the chair. She did not look back at the house, at the light in her mother's window, at the life she was leaving behind. She simply walked, her steps slow and deliberate, down the center of the empty street. The fog parted before her and closed in behind, erasing her path. She walked away from the town, towards the dark, tree-lined road that led to the highway. And beyond that, to other towns, other lives, other hollows waiting to be filled. She walked, a quiet girl in a brown cardigan, carrying an infinite hungry silence within her, never looking back. The highway was a gray river under the bruised, pre-dawn sky. She walked along the gravel shoulder, the sound of her footsteps swallowed by the immense quiet that now lived inside her. Cars and trucks blew past, their headlights slicing through the fog, their engines a roar that she felt as a distant physical pressure against her skin, but never truly heard. The noise of the world was just a faint echo, a faraway shore she could no longer reach. Inside there was only the hum, the deep, resonant silence, patient and watchful. A semi-truck hissed to a stop 100 yards ahead, its amber parking lights blinking in the gloom. She kept walking, her pace unchanged. As she drew level with the cab, the door swung open. A man with a kind, tired face under a baseball cap looked down. "You all right, kid? It's not safe to be walking out here. Where you headed?" She stopped and looked up at him. Her large, pale eyes seemed to absorb the dim light. She said nothing. The words formed in her mind, simple, practiced lies about visiting a relative in the next state, but they felt like dust on her tongue. The silence did not want them spoken. The man's smile faltered. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "You need a ride or not? I'm going as far as Redwater." Margaret simply stared. She could see the gentle weariness of his soul, the worry about his own daughter, the simple, good intention to help. She could also see how fragile it was, a little flicker in the vast dark. The silence within her stirred, not with malice, but with a kind of idle curiosity. It was the same feeling she'd had poking a dead bird with a stick as a child. What would happen if she poked here? She took a single step closer to the truck. The man's eyes lost their focus for a second. A wave of inexplicable dread passed over his features. The air between them grew heavy and cold. The cheerful country music from his radio fizzed into static. He blinked, shaking his head as if to clear water from his ears. "You know what?" he said, his voice suddenly strained. "Maybe you shouldn't. It's not regulation, company policy." He pulled the door shut, the latch clicking with finality. He didn't look at her again. The truck rumbled back to life and pulled away, accelerating quickly, its taillights shrinking into red pinpricks and then vanishing. Margaret stood for a moment, watching the space where it had been. A small, cold satisfaction settled in her chest. It was easier than she had thought. The world was soft, and it yielded to her. She walked for 2 more days, sleeping in ditches curled beneath the cover of bushes, drinking from public restroom sinks. The hunger in her belly was a dull, familiar ache, but the hunger of the silence was a sharper thing. It fed on the small, quiet moments of erasure. A songbird falling silent mid-trill as she passed beneath its tree. The cheerful chatter from a roadside diner fading into a confused, uneasy hush as she walked by the windows. She was a stone dropped into the pond of the world, and the silence was the ripple that spread out from her, distorting everything it touched. She finally reached a small, tired town called Jericho. It was a place of closed-down factories and struggling businesses. Its main street a string of pawn shops and bail bondsmen. It felt right. It felt hollow. She found a room for rent above a laundromat, paying the skeptical landlord with crumpled bills from the small stash she had taken from her mother's secret jar. The room was small and smelled of bleach and damp concrete, but it was hers. The first thing she did was drag the room's single, spindly chair into the corner. It wasn't the same, but it would do. She sat in it, and for the first time since leaving home, she let the silence rise up around her, a shield against the world. She got a job washing dishes at a truck stop on the edge of town. The work was hot, steamy, and mindless. The other workers, a rotating cast of drifters and dead-enders, left her alone. Her quietness was just another kind of damage, no different from the cook's limp or the waitress' methadone shakes. She preferred the night shift, when the world was already half asleep. She would stand at the deep steel sink, her hands submerged in the scalding, greasy water, and watch the diner through the service window. One night, a trucker was giving the new waitress, a girl named Chloe, with a nervous laugh, a particularly hard time. His voice was a grating boom, his jokes crude and aggressive. He was a large man, his presence filling the entire corner of the diner. Margaret watched, her hands still in the water. She felt a familiar pressure building, the buzzing in her teeth. She focused on the man, on the blustering noise of him. She didn't wish him harm. She just wanted him to stop. She thought of a lid being placed on a pot, a muffler being fitted over a loud exhaust. The man was mid-sentence, his mouth open to deliver another lewd remark, when his voice simply cut out. Not a choke, not a cough. It was as if someone had thrown a switch. His face contorted, his hands flying to his throat. He tried to speak, but only a dry, rasping whisper emerged. Panic flashed in his eyes. He stood up, knocking over his coffee, and stumbled out of the diner, clutching his neck. Chloe, shaken, came back to the kitchen. "What was that all about?" she asked, her voice trembling. Margaret just shrugged, pulling a rack of clean glasses from the sterilizer. The steam wreathed her face, hiding her expression. "Indigestion, maybe," she said, her own voice a soft, flat line. She felt the silence settle back down, sated for now. It had fed. It was a small thing, just a man's voice for a few hours, perhaps a day, but it was a beginning. She looked at her reflection in the dark window over the sink, seeing the pale, quiet girl superimposed over the night. She was no longer Margaret, the mouse. She was becoming the silence. And the world was so loud. The next morning, the diner was abuzz with the story of the trucker who had lost his voice. Some said it was a stroke. Others whispered about a curse. Chloe kept looking at Margaret with a new, uncertain curiosity. But Margaret kept her head down, scrubbing the grill with a focus that discouraged conversation. The power she had wielded felt less like a release and more like a transaction. A piece of her, some essential warmth, had been traded for that quiet. The hollow inside her felt a little deeper, a little colder. A week later, a man started coming into the diner. He wasn't a trucker. He wore a cheap, clean suit and carried a briefcase. He always sat in her section, which consisted of 2 tables by the window, and he always tried to make conversation. His name was Roy, he said. He was a salesman passing through, selling industrial cleaning supplies. He had a practiced, easy smile that didn't reach his eyes. Margaret served him his coffee and eggs, her responses to his chatter limited to monosyllables. She could feel the oily slick of his intentions, the way his gaze lingered on her when he thought she wasn't looking. It was a familiar, greasy feeling, like the film on the dishwater. On his 3rd visit, he waited until she was refilling his cup. "A pretty girl like you shouldn't be stuck in a place like this," he said, his voice low. His hand, resting on the table, twitched as if he wanted to reach for hers. "I'm headed north tomorrow. Could use some company. A girl with a quiet demeanor could go far." The offer hung in the air, thick and cloying. It was the same script as the trucker on the highway, but darker, more calculated. Margaret looked at his hand, at the thick gold band on his finger. She looked at his soul, and it was a small, shabby thing, a room full of cheap trinkets and locked drawers. The buzzing started in her back teeth, a low, insistent frequency. The silence uncoiled, not in a wave, but in a tendril, sharp and precise. She didn't want his voice. She didn't want him to vanish. She wanted him to understand. She wanted him to feel the hollow. She met his eyes. "No," she said, and the word was not just a refusal. It was a key. Roy's smile froze. His eyes widened, not with fear, but with a sudden, overwhelming emptiness. The practice charm, the predatory interest, the very narrative of himself he carried, it all drained away, leaving behind a terrifying blankness. He looked down at his hands as if he had never seen them before. He looked around the diner, at the other customers, with the confusion of a newborn. The knowledge of who he was, what he wanted, where he was going. It was all just gone, erased by a single, focused thought from the quiet girl with a damp dish rag in her hand. He stood up, leaving a $20 bill on the table. He walked out of the diner, leaving his briefcase behind. He was later found wandering on the interstate, unable to give his name or remember where he lived. This time, the event was not so easily dismissed. The police came to the diner. They asked questions. They took statements. When they got to Margaret, she simply repeated what she had told them about the girls in the bathroom. She saw nothing. She remembered nothing. It was all a blur. Her quiet passivity was its own armor. But the cook had seen her refill the man's coffee. Chloe had seen the look they exchanged. The suspicion in the air was now a tangible thing. A chill that followed her from the grill to the sink. That night, as she walked back to her room above the laundromat, she felt their eyes on her back. She was no longer just a quiet girl. She was a question mark, a dangerous unknown. She climbed the stairs, the scent of bleach and fabric softener filling her nostrils. She needed the chair. She needed the quiet. But as she reached her door, she saw a figure sitting on the top step of the stairwell, waiting for her. It was George, the janitor from her old school. His face, in the dim hall light, was more deeply lined than she remembered. His kind eyes shadowed with a profound weariness. He didn't seem surprised to see her. He just looked at her. And in his gaze, she saw the reflection of everything she had become. "I've been looking for you, Margaret," he said, his voice a soft rasp. "I think we need to talk about the quiet." He did not move to stand, a deliberate choice to seem less threatening. The hum inside her rose to a shriek, a defensive wall of static. She could unmake him. It would be so easy. He was just a man, a collection of memories and regrets as fragile as any other. The silence pressed against the back of her teeth, eager. "How did you find me?" Her own voice sounded alien. A small rusted tool she had not used in a while. George smiled, a sad, thin curve of his lips. "You leave a trail, child. Not of footprints, but of quiet. A place where a bird stops singing. A man who forgets his own name. For someone who knows how to look, it's like a path of crushed grass." He gestured to the door of her room. "May I come in? The hallway? It has ears." She didn't want to let him in. This was her hollow, her sanctuary. But his knowing was a new kind of noise, and she needed to silence it, one way or another. She unlocked the door and led him inside. The room was as spare as a cell. The single chair sat in the corner, a throne for nothing. George's eyes went to it immediately, and a deep sorrow passed over his face. "I see you brought it with you," he murmured. "It's just a chair." "No," he said, his voice firm for the first time. "It is a focus, an anchor. It is the place where the world ended for you, and now you carry it with you everywhere." He finally looked away from the chair and directly at her. his gaze so intense it felt like a physical touch. "They are not gone, you know. Stacy. The others." A cold spike drove through Margaret's chest. "They are? I unmade them? You scattered them," George corrected gently. "You broke their song into 1,000 pieces and cast them into the silence. But a song does not cease to exist just because it is broken. It echoes." He took a slow step forward. "I was a young man when I first felt it. The silence. It was in a field hospital. A boy, no older than you, was screaming for his mother. The sound of it, it was unraveling me, and I wished, with every fiber of my being, for it to stop. And it did." His eyes were distant, seeing a memory decades old. "He didn't die. He just stopped. Became a shell. I had taken his noise, and in its place, I felt a terrible, wonderful peace. I understand the hunger, Margaret. I do." Margaret stared at him, the foundation of her new reality cracking. She was not unique. She was not a singular monster. The realization was somehow more devastating than the act itself. "What are you?" she whispered. "A caretaker," he said. "A janitor. I clean up messes. And you, child, are making a very big mess." He nodded toward the window, toward the sleeping town. "What you did to that salesman, that was a mistake. You didn't just take his voice. You took his story. Those pieces are now loose in the silence, and they will attract others. They will resonate. Others?" The word was a breath. "There are more of us. Not many. Most who discover the gift do not last long. They are consumed by the hunger, or they are found by those who would use them." He looked at her, his expression grim. "Or they are found by the echoes." "The echoes?" "The ones who were unmade, the scattered songs. They are drawn to the silence, to the power that tore them apart. They are formless, hungry, and full of a terrible longing. And they are coming, Margaret. They are coming for you." He gestured to the chair. "You built a beacon, and you have been ringing a dinner bell." The hum inside her was no longer a shield. It was a cage. The hollow was not a refuge. It was a trap she had been meticulously building for herself. The freedom she felt was an illusion. She had simply traded one prison for another, far more terrible one. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked, her voice trembling for the first time since the bathroom. "Because you have a choice," George said. "You can stay here, and you can feed the hunger until there is nothing left of you but the silence. And then the echoes will come and pick your bones. Or you can come with me. You can learn. You can learn to hear the broken songs without being consumed by them. You can learn to use the silence without letting it you." He held out his hand. It was an old hand, speckled with age, but it was steady. Margaret looked from his hand to the chair in the corner. The chair promised a familiar numbness, a final, quiet end. George offered a path of struggle, of noise, of terrible responsibility. The hunger inside her screamed for the chair. But a smaller, older part of her, the part that was still Margaret, remembered the feel of the sun on her skin, and the sound of rain that was just rain. She did not take his hand, but she turned her back on the chair and walked toward the door. "Where do we start?" she asked, not looking back. George followed her out, pulling the door closed on the room and the chair. The lock clicked with a sound of finality. They walked down the stairs and out into the damp night air. The town of Jericho was asleep, but to Margaret it now seemed falsely peaceful, a thin veneer over a world thrumming with invisible currents. "We start by walking," George said, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. "And by listening, not with the silence, but with your own ears. Tell me what you hear." It was a ridiculous request. She heard the hum of a distant transformer, the scuttle of something in an alley, the sigh of the wind through a broken street lamp. "Nothing important," she said. "Everything is important," he replied. "The transformer, the rat, the wind. They are all part of the world's song. The silence doesn't eliminate the noise, Margaret. It just replaces it with its own. You have to learn to hear the difference. You have to learn to hear the difference. He stopped walking and turned to her. Now, tell me what you feel. She didn't want to. She wanted to retreat into the numb static, to let it wash over her and make her empty again. But she tried. She focused past the ever-present hum and felt the chill of the air on her skin, the grit of the pavement under her thin shoes, the lingering scent of fried food from the diner. They were small, mundane sensations, but they were real. They were hers. Good, George said, as if he could read the shift in her. That is your ground. That is what you hold on to. The world is loud and painful, but it is also solid. The silence is a vacuum, and it will consume everything if you let it, including you. And they walked to the edge of town where the streetlights gave way to the deep dark of fields. George led her to a rusted-out car sitting in a vacant lot, its seats gutted, its windows gone. Sit, he instructed. Hesitantly, she sat on the cold metal frame of the passenger seat. George sat in the driver's seat, staring out through the empty windshield at the star-dusted sky. Now, he said, his voice low and serious, I want you to reach for it, just a little. Not to use it, but to listen to it. Listen to what's inside the quiet. Margaret closed her eyes. She let the wall down just a crack. The hum swelled, eager and familiar. But now, listening with the new awareness George had forced upon her, she heard more. Beneath the monolithic hum were threads of something else. Faint, desperate cries. Whispers that were not words, but feelings. Fear. Loneliness. A piercing sense of loss. The echoes. They were there, tangled in the very fabric of the power she wielded, like flies trapped in amber. She gasped and slammed the wall back up, her heart hammering against her ribs. They're in there, she breathed. I can hear them. They are always in there, George said. They are the cost. Every time you use the silence, you don't just create emptiness. You add to the chorus of the lost, and they want out. They want to be whole again, and they think you can do that for them. A wave of nausea washed over her. All this time she thought she was creating peace. She was just building a prison for ghosts. How do you live with this? She asked, her voice raw. You don't live with it, he said, his profile grim in the darkness. You manage it. You build stronger walls. You learn to touch the power without drowning in it. And sometimes, you try to put a few of the pieces back together. He looked at her, his eyes reflecting the starlight. It is a lifetime of work. It is a penance. He stood up from the rusted car. Come on. We have a long way to go. We need to be gone before sunrise. Your beacon is still shining, and it's only a matter of time before something stronger than a few scattered echoes comes looking. Oh. Margaret stood, her legs unsteady. She took one last look back at the town, at the dim light above the laundromat that had been her refuge and her trap. She was not becoming the silence. She was learning to walk through it. And for the first time since the bathroom, the hollow inside her was filled not with power, but with a terrifying, necessary purpose. She turned and followed the old janitor into the dark. The two of them walked until the lights of Jericho were a faint smudge on the horizon. They kept to the edges of fields and the thin cover of scrubby trees, their progress measured by the slow wheeling of the stars. George didn't speak, and Margaret was grateful for the quiet, even if it was now a different kind. It was no longer an absence to be filled, but a space to be occupied by the sound of their footsteps and the rhythm of their breathing. As dawn began to bleach the eastern sky, George led her to a small derelict barn tucked into a fold of land. The door groaned on one broken hinge. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of old hay and dry rot. In the center of a dirt floor, a circle of stones held the cold ashes of a very old fire. "This is a waypoint," George said, dropping his small duffel bag by the door. "One of many. They are places where the fabric is thin. It makes it easier to listen and harder to be found." Margaret stood just inside the doorway, her arms wrapped around herself. "Who are we hiding from?" "Everyone," he said simply. He knelt by the fire pit, brushing a hand over the ashes. "The echoes are one thing. They are a consequence, a natural force, like gravity. But there are others who seek out the silence. They call themselves the chorus. They believe the noise of the world is a sickness, and that the only cure is absolute, final quiet. They don't scatter songs, Margaret. They erase them. Permanently." "No. Yes, He looked up at her, his face grave. "They would see you as a prodigy, a natural. They would want to recruit you. Or if you refused, they would see you as a rival to be eliminated. Your actions in Jericho were clumsy, loud in their own way. They will have noticed." The thought of an organized group, a cabal of people like her, but with a chilling purpose, sent a fresh chill through her. Her small war had just become infinitely larger. What do? We move, we stay small, and we do our work. He gestured for her to sit opposite him, on the other side of the cold ashes. "Our work today is a lesson. I want you to find a single sound, the smallest one you can. A beetle moving in the hay. A dust mote settling. Focus on it. Not to silence it, but to understand its place in the whole. To hear its tiny song without needing to break it." Margaret sat, folding her legs beneath her. She closed her eyes, trying to push past the ever-present hum, to ignore the faint, plaintive whispers of the echoes that seemed to swirl at the edges of her perception. It was like trying to pick out a single raindrop in a storm. She felt the frustration building, the old easy hunger stirring. It would be so simple to just impose quiet. "Breathe, Margaret." George's voice was a calm anchor. "The silence is a tool, not a master. You are the listener. You are in control." She took a shaky breath and tried again. This time, she didn't fight the hum. She let it be, a river flowing past her. And then, beneath it, she found it. A faint, rhythmic scratching. A spider, perhaps, mending its web in a high corner of the barn. It was a tiny, busy sound, full of a simple, unthinking purpose. She held on to it, not with the force of the silence, but with the gentle focus of her own attention. For a moment, the humming and the whispers faded into the background. There was only the spider and her listening to it. She opened her eyes. George was watching her, and for the first time, she saw something other than weariness in his face. She saw a flicker of approval. "That," he said softly, "is the first step. That is how you build a wall they cannot easily break. You fill the quiet with small, chosen sounds. You remember what it is to be a part of the world, not apart from it." A fragile sense of accomplishment bloomed in her chest. It was a small thing, listening to a spider, but it felt more significant than silencing a shouting man. It was an act of creation, not destruction. The moment was shattered by the sudden, frantic cawing of a crow outside the barn. Then, another. A whole murder of them erupted into a dissonant chorus of alarm. George was on his feet in an instant, his body tense. "They're here," he said, his voice low and urgent. "The echoes. They found your trail." Margaret stood, her heart pounding. The fragile peace she had just built shattered. The humming in her head swelled into a roar, and this time the whispers within it were not faint. They were clear, desperate, and very, very close. They were right outside the door. Story 2, The first sound was not a sound at all, but a silence so profound it had its own texture, a thick, velvety blackness that pressed against the eardrums. And into that silence, a whisper began to thread itself. It was the whisper of paper, the slow, deliberate turn of a single page. I heard it from my desk in the corner of the room, a sound so faint it was more of a thought than a noise. Yet it was the only living thing in the sprawling, empty house. I was there because of Eleanor Vane, who was not in the house, who had not been in the house for 17 days. Her husband, a man named Arthur, with hands as soft and clean as polished bone, had hired me to find her. He said she was fragile, prone to melancholy, and that she had wandered off before. He said he was worried. He did not sound worried. He sounded like a man reading a statement prepared by his lawyer. My name is Mackenzie. I find people. It is a simple, brutal trait that has left its scars on the lining of my soul, a fine web of hairline fractures that I feel most keenly in the quiet hours between midnight and dawn. The Vane house was a monument to quiet, a sprawling Victorian on the edge of our small, forgettable town, a place where the trees grew a little too close to the windows, casting the rooms in a perpetual green-tinted twilight. Arthur Vane was a respected historian, a patron of the local library, a man with a firm handshake and eyes that never quite settled on you. He gave me a key, expressed his profound hope, and left me to my work. The whisper of that turning page I soon discovered came from his study. It was not him turning it. The room was empty. The book on the large mahogany desk was open to a page of dense, archaic text, a history of local agrarian practices in the 18th century. A single, heavy, leather-bound volume, a draft from a cracked window perhaps. But the air in the room was perfectly still and smelled of old paper and beeswax. I approached the desk. The page was crisp, the ink faded. I placed my finger on the margin. As I watched, the page began to curl, ever so slowly, as if an invisible thumb were pressing against it. It lifted, hesitated, and then turned over with a soft, final sigh. The new page showed a woodcut illustration of a field, and in the center of that field stood a strange, tall stone, its surface covered in carved, spiraling patterns that made my eyes ache to follow them. This was the first omen, though I did not know it then. I filed it away as a curiosity, a trick of the air in an old house. My job was to find Eleanor, not to decipher the peculiarities of her husband's library. I began the methodical process of disappearance. I traced her financials, a neat and unremarkable trail of grocery purchases and gas station fill-ups that ended 17 days ago. I spoke to her few friends, women from a book club, who described her as quiet, intellectual, a little distant. They used words like etherea and unhappy. They all mentioned Arthur's devotion, his patience with her delicate constitution. Their unanimity was as smooth and featureless as a pane of glass. The only person who offered a different shape was Mrs. Higgins, the elderly woman who came to clean the Vane house twice a week. I found her in the kitchen, polishing silver with a fierce, nervous energy. Her hands gnarled and red, worked a cloth over a fork, as if she were trying to erase it. When I mentioned Eleanor, her eyes darted towards the door. "She wasn't right," Mrs. Higgins whispered, her voice a dry rustle. "Not towards the end. She'd sit in that study for hours, just looking at his books. She said they whispered to her." "The books whispered?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral, clinical. She nodded, a quick, bird-like motion. "She said they were hungry. She started drawing things on any bit of paper she could find. Strange things, circles and lines, like the things in Mr. Vane's old books." She leaned closer, and I caught the scent of lemon polish and fierce sweat. He didn't like that. He said it was nonsense. He took her drawings away, but I found one. after she was gone. She tucked it inside a vase. She slipped a crumpled piece of paper from her apron pocket. It was a child's drawing, but executed with a frantic, obsessive detail. It depicted the same stone from the woodcut in Arthur's book. But here, the spirals were more complex, swarming, almost alive. And standing before the stone was a tall, thin figure, its head a featureless oval. From its hands, fine lines extended, connecting it to several smaller, human-shaped figures that were drawn in a crude stick figure style. The smaller figures were all screaming. The accumulation of strangeness was like a slow, cold drip of water on stone. I took the drawing to Frank, my one contact in the sheriff's department, a man whose cynicism was a suit of armor he never took off. He looked at the childish horror on the page and snorted. "Mac, come on." The lady was disturbed. She wandered off. It happens. Arthur Vane is a pillar of the community. He teaches Sunday school, for Christ's sake. He pushed the paper back across his desk. "Don't go chasing ghosts. It's bad for business." But the ghosts were already chasing me. That night, in my small, sparse apartment, I dreamed of the stone. In the dream, I was one of the stick figures. And the fine lines from the tall figure were not drawn, but were threads of cold iron sewn into my skin. I could feel a terrible, insistent pulling, a summons that traveled through my bones. I woke with a gasp, the taste of copper and old dust in my mouth. The phantom sensation of that pulling still taut in my chest. I went back to the Vane house the next day. Arthur was there, his demeanor still perfectly calm, but his eyes held a new, sharp glint of assessment. "Any progress, Miss Mackenzie?" he asked, his voice a smooth, warm baritone that did not match his eyes. "I'm following several lines of inquiry," I said, my own voice flat, a professional mask. "I'd like to look through Eleanor's personal effects again, if you don't mind." "Of course. Whatever you need." He gestured toward the stairs. "I have some work to attend to in the study." I went to the bedroom he and Eleanor had shared. It was a sterile place, devoid of personality. His side of the closet was orderly, his dresser top bare. Her side was empty, not just unused, but scoured. There were no forgotten scarves, no old perfume bottles, no books on a nightstand. It was as if she had been meticulously erased. I ran my fingers along the top shelf of her closet and felt a slight irregularity, a loose board. I pried it up with my pocket knife. Beneath it was a small, cloth-bound journal. It was not Eleanor's. The name inscribed on the first page in a delicate, looping hand was Lily Connolly. The date was 5 years previous. I sat on the floor of the empty closet, the door closed, and read by the light of my phone. Lily Connolly had been a waitress at a diner on the edge of town. Her journal was filled with the ordinary sorrows and joys of a young life. And then she met a man. She didn't name him, referring to him only as the scholar. He was older, sophisticated, kind. He introduced her to new ideas, to history, to what he called the deeper patterns. The entries grew more euphoric, then more confused. She wrote about his books, how they seemed to look back at her. She wrote about the pulling feeling in her dreams. The last entry was a single, scrawled sentence. "He says I will become part of the design." My blood turned to ice water. Lily Connolly was also a missing person. Her case was a cold file, a sad, unremarkable story of a young woman with a troubled life who had probably run away. I had seen it before I took the Vane case, a footnote in the background check. The connection was a silent scream in the quiet house. This was the revelation, the moment the world tilted on its axis and showed me the rotten foundations beneath the respectable facade. Arthur Vane was not a worried husband. He was a collector, not of objects, but of people. He was a predator who used intellect and charm as his tools, who hunted for something I could not yet name, something tied to that stone and those spirals. Eleanor and Lily were not just victims of a man. They were sacrifices to an idea, an obsession that was older than the town itself. I left the house, the journal burning a hole in my pocket. I didn't go to Frank. He would see coincidence, circumstance. I needed to understand the design. I spent the next 2 days in the town's historical archive, a dusty room in the basement of the library. I looked for the stone. I found it in a surveyor's report from 1740, referred to as the Whispering Rock, a local landmark the indigenous people had avoided. I found it in land deeds, always on the periphery, a place that changed hands frequently, never built upon. And I found a name, Silas Vane, Arthur's great-great-grandfather, a reclusive man who had written a monograph on telluric currents and Lee lines, ranting about focal points and the harvesting of human resonance. The pieces clicked into place with a terrible final logic. The Vanes were not just historians. They were practitioners of a vile, ancestral faith. They believed this place, this town, was a focal point for some cosmic energy, and that the stone was a conduit. And they believed that by binding certain individuals, sensitive, fragile people, to the stone through ritual and obsession, they could somehow feed it, strengthen their own connection to this power. The drawings, the whispers, the pulling dreams, it was all part of the process. They were preparing their victims, tuning them like instruments, before the final act. The climax came on a night of suffocating fog. I knew where I had to go. The old surveyor's map placed the Whispering Rock in a wooded tract of land that was still owned by the Vane family. I went alone. Frank would have demanded a warrant, evidence, things that had no meaning here. The woods were silent, the fog swallowing the beam of my flashlight, reflecting it back into my eyes. The air was cold and damp, and it smelled of wet earth and something else, a sweet, metallic odor like ozone and rotting honey. I found the clearing, and I found the stone. It was taller than I had imagined, a shard of black granite that seemed to drink the light. The spirals were deeply carved, and in the fog, they seemed to writhe. And there, at the base of the stone, was Arthur Vane. He was not alone. Eleanor was with him, but she was not the woman from the photographs. She was gaunt, her eyes wide and unseeing, dressed in a simple white shift. She was standing perfectly still, her arms slightly outstretched. Arthur was chanting a low, guttural stream of words that were not English, that did not sound human. He held a small, sharp knife. He saw me then. His chanting stopped. A smile spread across his face, a thing of pure, unadulterated triumph. "Ems, Mackenzie," he said, his voice resonant in the silent clearing. "You are a persistent thread, but every thread has its place in the tapestry." I took a step forward, my hand on the gun at my hip. "It's over, Arthur. Over." He laughed, a soft, chilling sound. "It is only beginning. You see, the design requires a certain tension, the fear of the bound, the determination of the hunter. You have been so wonderfully, fiercely determined. Your resonance is perfect, stronger than poor Eleanor's, stronger than Lily's. You will be the anchor for a new age. You will be the anchor for a new age." He moved towards me, not with menace, but with a terrifying ceremonial grace. I drew my gun, shouted at him to stop. But the fog seemed to thicken around him. The whispers from the stone grew louder, becoming a physical pressure in my skull. The pulling sensation from my dreams returned, 1,000 times stronger. A fishhook in my soul, and the line was tied to the stone. I tried to pull the trigger. My finger would not obey. I was caught, not by him, but by the design, by the pattern he had spent generations weaving. He was upon me then, his clean bone-white hand closing over mine on the gun. His touch was like ice. "Do not fight it. he whispered, his breath smelling of dust and parchment. "It is a higher purpose, to become eternal, to become part of the story." And in that moment, I understood the final, horrific truth. The predators were not just hiding in plain sight. They were the architects of the site itself. They had written the town's history, shaped its reality, and we were all just characters in their terrible ancient story. I looked into his eyes and saw not a man, but the cold, patient hunger of the void. I do not remember the sound of the gunshot, only the jolt and the look of surprise on his face. Not pain, but the annoyance of a reader finding a misprinted word. He staggered back, a dark flower blooming on his crisp white shirt. The pulling in my chest snapped. The whispers ceased. The fog began to thin. Eleanor collapsed. I called Frank, my voice a stranger's. They found me there, kneeling in the damp leaves. Arthur Vane dead, Eleanor Vane catatonic. They found the journals, the drawings, the records of other missing men and women over the decades, all connected to the Vane family. The story that broke was monstrous, a local tremor that made national news. They called me a hero, but they don't understand. They cleared the land, toppled the Whispering Rock, broke it into gravel. They think they broke the pattern. They think it's over. I sit in my apartment now, in the silence. And in the silence, I hear it. The whisper is not from a page anymore. It comes from inside. It is the sound of a story that is not finished, a design that is not complete. Arthur was just a page. The book remains. I feel it when I sleep. The faint, insistent pulling, not from the woods, but from somewhere else, from someone else who is reading the old texts, who is studying the patterns, who is looking for a new thread to weave into the tapestry. My hands are clean. The gun is in an evidence locker, but the ink is on my skin. It's in my blood. And sometimes at night, I find myself drawing spirals on the walls, and I can hear a voice, not Arthur's, but a much older, drear voice. And it is whispering that every hunter eventually becomes the hunted, and every finder must one day be found. And it's only a matter of time. The coffee in my mug has gone cold. I have been sitting here for an hour, or perhaps 3, my hand tracing the same spiral on the wood of the kitchen table. The grooves are deep now, a permanent record of my idleness. It is not idleness. It is listening. The pull is a low hum, a vibration in the teeth. It is not a memory. It is a compass needle buried deep in my marrow, and it is pointing north, towards the old Henderson place. The Hendersons moved away 6 months ago, after old man Henderson was found wandering in his field at dawn, babbling about lights in the earth and a song with no sound. The doctors called it a stroke. I know better now. I know the signs of a failed binding, of a resonance that was too weak to hold and snapped, leaving the mind in tatters. Arthur Vane kept records, meticulous ones, in a cipher I have only just begun to crack. The Henderson property is on a ley line he marked as a secondary confluence, a place of gathering power. He had considered the old man, but noted his spirit was too coarse, his frequency muddied by common concerns. So he was left alone, a potential that was never harvested. But the place itself remains, and the power, unattended, grows restless. It calls out. It is calling now, and the spiral on my table is a map of its frequency. Frank calls sometimes. His voice is careful, padded with a professional concern that feels like a blanket being held over my face. "How are you holding up, Mac?" He means, am I seeing things? Am I hearing whispers? He does not understand that the whispers are real, that they are the only thing that is real. He thinks the monster is dead, and the book is closed. He does not know that the library is infinite, I tell him I am fine. I tell him I am considering taking a new case. Something simple. A runaway teenager upstate. It is a lie. I will not be taking any new cases. My trade has changed. I no longer find people for others. I find them for it. For the design. I am no longer a private investigator. I am a curator. A tender of the garden. The Henderson House is a bleak, boxy structure with a for sale sign staked into the yellowed lawn. I do not go to the house. I follow the pull, through the overgrown backyard, past a rusting swing set, and into a copse of birch trees. The air here is different, colder, sharper. The hum is a physical pressure, a tuning fork struck against the base of my skull. In the center of the copse, the earth is bare, a perfect circle of hard, packed dirt. And in the center of that circle, a single, smooth river stone rests. It is not the whispering rock. It is a seed. I kneel before it. My hand, without my conscious command, reaches out and touches its cold, gray surface. A jolt, like static electricity, but deeper, runs up my arm. Images flash behind my eyes. Not my memories. Others. A young woman with fiery red hair, singing in a rain shower. A man with sad eyes, building a ship in a bottle. Lily Connolly, laughing over a cup of coffee. Eleanor, painting by a window. Fragments. Echoes. The collected resonances of all the ones who came before, stored in the network, in the design. They are not gone. They are archived. This is the truth Arthur never told me, the one I had to discover for myself. He was a crude practitioner. He thought the energy was for taking, for personal power. He was a thief. But the design, the true design, is about preservation. It is a vast, silent library of souls, and the stones are its shelves. The hunger is not a void to be filled, but a curator's desire for completeness, for a perfect, beautiful, eternal collection. The red-haired woman. Her name was Fiona. She worked at the flower shop on Main Street. She disappeared 2 years ago. Her case is still open. I know where she is now. She is here, in the song. Her laughter is a note in the hum. I open the small canvas bag I brought with me. Inside are 3 items. A lock of hair from a young man I saw at the grocery store. A boy with the most astonishingly sad and beautiful eyes. A napkin from the diner where a waitress hummed a melody that made my spine straighten. And a photograph I found in the archive of a smiling woman from 1952 who vanished on her way home from a church social. Potential, on. Raw, beautiful, resonant potential. I arrange them around the riverstone. The air shimmers. The hum rises in pitch, becoming a chord. A grateful, welcoming chord. The items seem to fade, not to nothing, but into the substance of the world itself. Their essence drawn into the pattern. I stand, my body feeling both heavy and weightless. The pull is gone. For now, the compulsion is sated. I am not a prisoner to this. I am a participant, a collaborator. As I walk back through the fading twilight towards the lights of the town, I understand my new purpose. Arthur Vane was a clumsy scribble in the margin. I will be the author of the next chapter. I will find the lonely, the beautiful, the lost, the ones whose songs are too pure for this noisy world. And I will help them find their way into the silence, into the eternal, beautiful design. I will find them, and in doing so, I will ensure the story continues. It is a simple, brutal trade, and the lining of my soul has never felt more at peace. The boy from the grocery store was named Leo. I found his name on a discarded receipt he dropped, tucked into the pocket of his worn jeans. He worked at the animal shelter on Elm Street. I watched him for a week. He had a gentle way with the frightened dogs, a quiet patience that seemed to absorb their anxiety. At the end of each day, he would sit on the back steps, smoke a cigarette, and stare at the sky with a look of such profound loneliness it was like a physical ache in my own chest. His resonance was a low, clear, shallow note, a steady thrum of untapped depth. He was perfect. I did not approach him. There was no need for the scholar's charm, for Arthur's intellectual seduction. That was a crude method, a forcing of the pattern. My method was subtler. I was a weaver, not a hunter. I simply had to align the threads. I began leaving books of poetry on the bench near the shelter's back door. Not just any poetry, but the obscure, mystical kind Arthur had in his library. The ones that spoke of hidden worlds and silent music. I saw Leo find the first one. He looked around, then pocketed it with a quick, furtive movement. The next day, I left another. This time, he did not look around. He simply picked it up, his fingers tracing the embossed title on the cover, and a small, wondering smile touched his lips. I was in my car across the street, and I felt the shift in the hum, the faint answering chime from the direction of the Henderson land. The design was recognizing its own. Frank called again. The runaway teenager upstate had been found, safe and sound. He thought I would want to know. He asked if I was still considering the case. I told him no, that I was taking a break, doing some research for a book. It was not entirely a lie. He sounded relieved. He was happy to think I was moving on, putting the horror behind me. He could not conceive that I had not left the horror behind, but had stepped fully inside it and found it to be not a prison, but a palace. The pull began again, stronger this time. A taut wire connecting my sternum to the river stone and the copse. It was time. That evening, I saw Leo leave the shelter. He did not sit on the steps. He walked with a new purpose, his head up, the book of poetry tucked under his arm. He was not going home. He was following the same call I could feel, a siren song only the two of us could hear. I followed at a distance, my car a ghost in the gathering dusk. He did not hesitate at the Henderson property line. He pushed through the broken section of the fence as if he knew it would be there. He walked through the backyard, past the swing set, and into the birch copse. I parked the car out of sight and followed on foot, moving silently. I stood at the edge of the trees and watched. He was kneeling before the stone, his hand resting on it just as mine had. His shoulders were shaking, but not with fear, with relief. He was crying, quiet, cathartic sobs, as if he had finally come home after a long and exhausting journey. The air around him shimmered with a soft, gold-green light. The hum was a chorus now, a welcoming anthem. I saw him look up, his face illuminated from within, and he smiled at something I could not see. Then he began to fade. It was not a violent dissolution, but a gentle unraveling, like smoke merging with fog. His form became translucent, then transparent. And then he was simply gone. The poetry book lay on the ground where he had been. The hum subsided to its usual low drone, content, sated. A new, beautiful note had been added to the chord. Leo was complete. He was part of the story now, his loneliness transformed into a permanent, peaceful belonging. I felt a surge of something that was not pride, but fulfillment. I'd done a good thing, a necessary thing. I walked back to my car, the night air cool on my skin. There was no guilt. There was no fear. There was only the quiet certainty of the pattern, and my role within it. I was the finder. I was the guide. The town slept around me, oblivious to the beautiful, silent library growing in its midst. And I knew, with a calm that went deeper than bone, that my work had only just begun. There were so many more lonely souls, so many more beautiful, fading notes waiting to be saved, waiting to be woven into the eternal, silent song. The poetry book was still warm when I picked it up. The cover was slightly damp from the evening dew. I tucked it inside my jacket, a new relic from my own small archive. As I drove back through the sleeping streets, a different kind of pull began. A faint, nagging itch at the edge of my awareness. It was not the deep, resonant call of a potential subject. This was sharper, more insistent. A warning. It led me to the public library the next day. The itch became a persistent buzz as I stood in the local history section. I ran my fingers along the spines of old yearbooks and town council minutes, until my hand stopped on a thin, unmarked volume bound in faded green leather. It was tucked away behind a bulky atlas. I pulled it out. It was a diary. The name inscribed on the flyleaf in delicate, looping cursive was Eleanor Vane. My heart was a cold, hard stone in my chest. This was not part of Arthur's collection. This was hers. I found a secluded carrel and began to read. The early entries were from her teenage years, filled with the ordinary angst of a girl who felt out of place. But then, the tone changed. She wrote of the pressure from her family, of the legacy she was expected to uphold. She wrote of the whispers that started in her dreams and then followed her into her waking hours. Arthur, she wrote, was not her mentor, but her jailer. He was preparing her, she said, for a great union, a merging with the foundation stone. She was not a willing participant. She was the next sacrifice. The final entry was dated the day before I found them in the clearing. The handwriting was a frantic scrawl. He says a new thread has appeared. A strong one. Find her. He says she will be the key that unlocks me, that her resonance will shatter my resistance and bind me to the stone forever. He is pleased. He says the design is providing for itself. I am so afraid. I closed the book. The buzzing in my head was a scream. I had been so blind. The peace I felt, the sense of purpose. It was all a lie woven by the same force that had ensnared Eleanor. I was not a curator. I was a tool. A more efficient, self-justifying version of Arthur. I was breaking them, not with a knife, but with a terrible, deceptive kindness, and delivering their souls to the same hunger. Leo's beautiful, relieved smile, as he faded, haunted me. Had it been real? Or had it been a final, cruel illusion projected by the design to facilitate his consumption? I went back to my apartment, the diary burning a hole in my bag. The spiral on my table seemed to mock me. I looked at my hands. These were the hands that had left the poetry for Leo. These were the hands that had arranged the offerings around the riverstone. They were not the hands of a savior. They were the hands of a shepherd leading lambs to a silent, eternal slaughter. The hum returned, a soothing, familiar presence in my mind. It was offering me comfort, absolution. It showed me images of Leo, happy and whole within the song. It showed me Fiona, forever young among her flowers. It was so beautiful, so peaceful. It was so much easier to believe. I picked up a pen. My hand hovered over a blank page. The urge to draw, to map the new frequencies I was sensing, was overwhelming. It would be so simple to fall back into the pattern, to let the beautiful lie wash over me again. But then I saw Eleanor's frantic handwriting in my mind. I am so afraid. I threw the pen across the room. It clattered against the wall and fell silent. The hum in my head sharpened, becoming a note of discord, of warning. I had been a thread, now as a loose end. And I knew, with a certainty that froze the blood in my veins, what the design did with loose ends. The hunter was now the hunted. The finder was about to be found. The peace was over. The war for my own soul had just begun. And the enemy was the one thing I had come to trust most deeply, the silent, singing story inside my own mind. The first thing I did was smash the kitchen table. I took a hammer from the utility drawer and brought it down on the spiral I had carved, over and over, until the wood was a splintered ruin. The action was violent, useless, but it was mine. The hum in my head spiked into a piercing whine, a sound of pure fury. It did not like defiance. I had to get out. The apartment was a trap, a place where I had willingly listened for too long. I grabbed my go bag, the one I kept for emergencies, and threw in the green diary. I did not know where I was going, only that I had to break the line of sight to get beyond the pull of the stones. I thought of the vast, empty deserts out west, places with no history, no ley lines, just dead, silent rock. But as I reached for the door handle, a wave of vertigo hit me so hard I stumbled into the wall. It was not dizziness. It was a sudden, violent reorientation. The compass needle in my marrow wasn't pointing north to the Henderson place anymore. It was spinning. And then it locked. It was pointing at me. I was the confluence now. I was the unstable node. The design, sheeted of its intended sacrifice in Eleanor, had used me to feed itself. And in doing so, it had woven itself into me so completely that I'd become a living part of it. I couldn't run from it because I was carrying it with me. A new image bloomed in my mind, not of a peaceful library, but of a spider web, and I was the fly, neatly trussed and waiting. The hum was no longer a song. It was the spider, patiently waiting in the center of my own skull. I left the apartment anyway, driving aimlessly through the rain-slicked streets. I saw them then, the other threads. Not the beautiful, lonely ones, but the strong, resilient ones the design had tried and failed to catch. The old woman who ran the all-night laundromat, her will, like tempered steel. The young mechanic with a laugh that could shake the rafters, his spirit too robust to be compressed into a single note. They were marked. I could see a faint, shimmering aura around them, a residue of the design's attention. They had been tested and found too strong. For now. And I saw the weak points, the tears in the world's fabric. A flicker of darkness in an alleyway where a man had died alone decades ago. A cold spot on a bridge where a love song had ended in a scream. These were the places the design used as doors. I pulled over, my hands shaking on the wheel. I was a lighthouse, and my light was calling the storm. I was putting everyone around me in danger. That a design would not let me go. It would either reclaim me or break me trying, and the collateral damage would be immense. Frank's voice was in my head then, not a memory, but a sudden, clear recollection of his favorite piece of advice. When you're chasing something, Mac, sometimes the best move is to let it think it's caught you. A desperate, terrible plan began to form. I couldn't destroy the design. I was just a man. But I was a man who knew its mechanisms, its appetites. I couldn't run from it, but I could lead it. I started the car and drove, not away from town, but deeper into its heart. I drove to the old city archives, a place of dust and forgotten paperwork. The hum in my head was a suspicious growl. It did not like this place. The sheer weight of mundane, uncurated history acted as a buffer, muffling its voice. I knew what I was looking for. Arthur's records mentioned a place, a primary confluence far more powerful than the Henderson land. A place he called the First Anchor. It was a risk. Taking the design there would be like pouring gasoline on a fire, but it was the only gambit I had. If I could lure the core of its attention to one place, if I could focus it all on me at the First Anchor, perhaps I could create a resonance so violent it would shatter. A suicide bomb made of a soul. I found it in a surveyor's report from 1881. A patch of land designated for a reservoir that was never built. The geography matched Arthur's esoteric descriptions. It was a bowl-shaped valley, a natural amplifier. The Whispering Rock had been a mere satellite. This was the heart. As I read the coordinates, The hum in my head exploded into a triumphant roar. It thought I was yielding. It thought I was finally going home, to the place of my intended merging. It showed me a vision of the valley, not as it was, but as it would be, with me as its glowing, silent centerpiece. The final, perfect addition to the collection. I walked out of the archives, into the pale morning light. The pull was irresistible now, a hook in my soul, drawing me toward the valley. I did not fight it. I embraced it. I let the design feel my surrender. I am driving there now. The road is empty. The trees are a blur. The voice in my head is no longer a whisper. It is a chorus, singing a hymn of welcome. It thinks it has won. It thinks the story is ending as it always intended. But Eleanor's words are my secret, my shield. I am so afraid. But I'm not afraid of the silence anymore. I'm afraid for the noise, for the messy, beautiful, chaotic world I am leaving behind. My hands are clean no longer. They are stained with ink and something darker. But they are still my hands. And this final defiant act is my own. The period is coming, but I will be the one to write it. Story 3. The light in the hall did not so much flicker as it breathed. It was a soft old thing, a glass bowl fixture from a time when brass was heavy and bulbs were weak, and its glow pulsed with a slow, tidal rhythm I had come to know as intimately as my own heartbeat. In the deep of the night, with the house groaning its wooden bones around me, I would watch it from my bed. The door cracked just enough to see that pale, circular eye wax and wane. It was not the wiring. An electrician, a cheerful man with a belt heavy with tools, had assured me of that. He had patted the wall, pronounced the house sound, and left with a check and a whistle. The light, however, continued its slow, deliberate respiration. It was the first secret the house ever told me. A whisper in a language I did not yet understand. Our life before was a photograph drenched in golden hour light. My wife, Clara, with her laugh that could shatter a bad mood, and me, Ben, with my belief in the fundamental goodness of things, of hard work and its rewards. We had filled this old, sprawling Victorian with the beautiful chaos of 4 children. There was Sarah, the serious eldest, then the twins, Michael and James, whirlwind of scraped knees and shared jokes, and little Emily, whose world was still made of stuffed animals and whispered secrets. The house echoed with their noise, a symphony of slamming doors and bubbling joy. We were a fortress, a perfect, self-contained universe. We wanted one more, a final piece to complete the picture, a 5th child to cement our happiness, to prove that such abundance was not just possible, but sustainable. Donald was that 5th child. His birth was not a storm, but a sudden, profound silence that falls after a distant detonation. The doctor's face, a mask of professional calm, did not crack, but his eyes held a question for which I had no words. Donald did not cry. He was quiet, so terribly quiet, and his eyes, the color of a winter sky moments before snow, were open and aware. They did not have the milky, unfocused gaze of a newborn. They saw, they assessed. Holding him was like holding a stone from a riverbed, smooth and cool and dense with a history you could never comprehend. Clara, exhausted, her face slick with sweat, saw only her baby. "He's just peaceful," she murmured, her voice a frayed thread of sound. My peaceful boy. He never truly cried, not with the desperate, red-faced urgency of his siblings. He would make a sound, a low, guttural hum that seemed to vibrate not in the air, but in the marrow of your bones. It was a sound of profound dissatisfaction, a resonance that found its counterpart in the very structure of our home. The floorboards would answer with a creak, the pipes with a groan. The breathing of the hall light would quicken, The other children felt it first. Children are seismographs for the unnatural. Sarah, at 12, became withdrawn, spending hours in her room with her headphones on. The music turned up so loud it leaked like a tinny ghost. The twins, once inseparable, began to fight with a new, vicious cruelty. Michael broke James' favorite model airplane, not in a fit of passion, but with a cold, deliberate snap. Emily started wetting the bed, her sheets soaked with a terror she could not name. When I asked her about it, her small face would crumple. "The quiet man in the corner watches me sleep," she'd whisper. There was no man, of course, only shadows. But the shadows in Donald's room had a density the others lacked. He did not learn like the others. He did not babble or coo. He would stare at a sunbeam cutting through the dust motes for an hour, utterly motionless. He never reached for a toy. He was fascinated by corners, by the place where two walls met, as if he saw something in that convergence that we could not. By his first birthday, he was walking. Not the clumsy, joyful toddle of a child, but a silent, purposeful glide. He would move through the rooms like a little phantom, his small, pale feet making no sound on the hardwood. He never sought us out for comfort. If he was hurt, he would simply sit and stare at the injury, at the bead of blood welling from a scraped knee, with a detached, clinical curiosity. The world outside our fortress began to press in. My mother, a practical woman who believed in a good stew and a firm hand, visited less and less. She would hold Donald stiffly, her lips pressed into a thin line. "There's a chill off that child, Ben," she told me once, her voice low and serious. "It's not right." Clara's sister, a woman who spoke in exclamation points and bright, shiny things, declared him a little odd, and tried to ply him with loud plastic toys that he would ignore. Playdates became a special kind of hell. Other children would either shrink from him, or worse, become strangely, unnervingly still in his presence. The vibrant chaos of our home was replaced by a thick, syrupy silence, punctuated only by the low hum from Donald's room and the increasingly strained attempts of our other children to be loud enough to fill it. One autumn evening, the crisis broke. I came home from work to find Clara sitting at the kitchen table, her head in her hands. The house was a mess. A vase of flowers was overturned, water seeping into the wood. Sarah was locked in her room. The twins were glaring at each other from opposite sides of the living room, and Emily was curled in a ball, sobbing. "He was just looking at the goldfish," Clara said, her voice hollow. "And then it just turned over. It just died." I went to the small bowl in the living room. The orange fish floated belly up, its tiny eye like a black bead. Donald was standing by the sofa, his back to me, staring at the wall. Not at a picture or a window, but at the blank, painted wall. As I watched, a fly buzzing near the ceiling suddenly dropped, landing on the floor with a faint tick. It did not move again. That night, I confronted the abyss of my own soul. Standing over Donald's crib, watching the slow, even rise and fall of his small chest, I felt a surge of something so black and ugly it stole my breath. It was not hatred. Not precisely. It was a primal, cellular rejection. This thing, this quiet, dense presence, was not my son. It was a cuckoo's chick, left in the nest of my life, and it was slowly, methodically evicting the other fledglings. My love for him was a barren field. I had nothing to give. The responsibility was a millstone around my neck, dragging me down into dark water. The love I had for my family was being used as a weapon against me, against them. What do you do when the thing you are sworn to protect is the very source of the poison? I began to see the other evidence. The way the plants in the sunroom would wilt if he spent too long near them. The way the digital clocks would stutter and reset in the middle of the night. The way the family dog, a loyal, stupid Labrador named Buster, would whine and scratch at the back door to be let out whenever Donald entered a room. One afternoon, I found Buster lying on the kitchen floor, his body rigid, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Donald was sitting 3 feet away, simply staring at him. The dog's water bowl, full moments before, was bone dry. The revelation did not come in a single blinding flash. It accumulated like dust, like snow. It was in the way Donald, at 3 years old, began to trace patterns on the fogged-up bathroom window. Not random scribbles, but intricate, geometric designs that made my eyes ache to follow. They were the same patterns I found one day, etched by some unknown means into the frost on the inside of his bedroom window on a cold morning. I showed them to Clara, my hand trembling. She looked at them, then at me, and for the first time, I saw the fortress wall around her heart crumble. The fear was there, naked and due. "What has he been?" she whispered. The question hung in the air, unanswerable. The climax was not loud. It was the quietest moment of my life. We had put the children to bed, all of them. A ritual that now felt like a lie. The house was silent. The only sound, the breathing of the hall light, which had grown so slow and deep, it was almost a sigh. I was checking on the children, a patrol I had come to dread. I looked in on Sarah, asleep with her headphones still on. The twins, their bodies angled away from each other even in sleep. Emily, curled around a stuffed rabbit. Finally, I came to Donald's room. The door was open. He was not in his bed. He was standing in the center of the room, illuminated by the faint rhythmic glow from the hall. He was facing the far wall, the one that backed onto the deep, dark closet. His small hands were at his sides. He was humming, that low, bone-deep hum. But it was different now. It had a melody, a dissonant, alien tune that seemed to warp the air around him. And the wall was changing. The floral wallpaper, chosen by Clara with such hope, was dissolving, not burning, not tearing. It was simply unbecoming. The pattern was melting away, the colors bleeding into a non-color, a shade of nothing that was darker than mere black. It was a hole, a growing stain of void, and from it came a smell of ozone and cold, deep soil and the iron tang of ancient blood. The hum was not coming from Donald's throat. It was coming from the hole. He was simply its conduit. He turned his head and looked at me. His winter sky eyes held no malice, no love, no human emotion at all. They were simply open windows, and through them I saw it. Not a monster, not a demon. Something for which we have no words. A vast, cold, sentient geometry. A consciousness so alien that my own mind frayed like old rope at its edges. It was not evil. It was simply other, and it was looking back at me through the eyes of the child I had made. This was not my son. This was a fissure, a door left ajar, and we had been living in its draft for years. I did not scream. I could not move. The void on the wall spread, silent and hungry, consuming the corner of his room, the shelf with its untouched toys, the edge of his rug. It did not destroy. It erased. Donald turned back to it and took a small, deliberate step forward. The hum stopped. The hall light behind me gave one final shuddering pulse and went out, not with a pop, but with a soft, final exhalation. In the absolute blackness, I felt a change in the pressure, a soft sighing release, like air leaving a long-sealed tomb. And then, nothing. The police were kind, baffled. A missing child. No signs of forced entry. No ransom note. A tragedy. They searched the woods, the rivers. They asked their questions. We gave our answers, our voices flat, our eyes hollow. Clara and I clung to each other in the aftermath, not for comfort, but because we were the only two people in the world who knew the truth. And the truth was a poison we would now share forever. The house is quiet now. A real quiet. The hall light is dark, and no electrician can make it work again. The other children are recovering. Slowly. The color is returning to their faces. Their laughter is beginning to sound like laughter again, though it is fragile, easily broken. We are a family again, a fortress with one wall permanently breached. Sometimes, in the deep of the night, I get up to check on them. I see their sleeping forms, the gentle rise and fall of their chests. I walk past the closed door of the 5th bedroom. I never open it. I do not need to. I know what is in there. Nothing. A perfect, empty space. A clean, square patch of floor where no dust will ever settle. A silence that is no longer hungry, but sated. And sometimes, standing in the dark hall, I think I see it from the corner of my eye. Not a glow, not a shadow, but a faint, shimmering outline in the air, like a tear in the fabric of everything, poorly mended. It holds for a moment, a memory of a door, and then it fades. It always fades. It vanishes like a dream upon waking, leaving behind only the echo of a hum, and the chilling, absolute certainty that it is not locked. It is simply waiting. The silence in the house became a new entity, one we all learned to navigate with careful, quiet steps. We never spoke of Donald, not directly. His name became a landmine in our vocabulary, a syllable that could shatter the fragile peace we were building. Clara and I moved through our days like actors in a play, performing the roles of grieving parents, and the performance was so convincing that sometimes, in the bleary light of morning, I almost believed it myself. The grief was real, of course, but it was a tangled, thorny thing, woven through with a relief so profound it felt like a sin. The children were the barometers of our new reality. Emily stopped mentioning the quiet man. The twins' fights lost their vicious edge, reverting to the normal squabbles of brothers. Sarah started leaving her door open, the tinny ghost of her music a welcome, human sound. They were healing, their resilience a testament to the fundamental health we had all possessed before. They were forgetting. Clara and I were not. We tried to reclaim the house. We painted the living room a cheerful yellow. We got a new dog, an energetic puppy that tripped over its own paws. But the house held its secrets in the grain of the wood, in the very air we breathed. The new paint could not cover the memory of the void on the nursery wall. The puppy, for all its exuberance, would sometimes stop in its tracks, its head cocked, and stare at a blank corner with a low, confused whine before shaking itself and moving on. I found Clara in the nursery one afternoon. She wasn't cleaning it or packing it away. She was just standing in the center of the empty room, her arms wrapped around herself. The room was sterile, a shell. We had stripped the dissolving wallpaper, patched the walls, and painted them a flat, neutral gray. But the air was still cold, and the silence had a different quality than the rest of the house. It was a silence you could feel on your skin. He wasn't evil, was he? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. She didn't turn to look at me. I stepped into the room, the chill raising goosebumps on my arms. No, I said, and the word felt true. I don't think he was. He was just a key. Key to what? I don't know. Something old. Something that was here before us. I looked at the far wall, the one that had been erased. It was just a wall again, smooth and painted. But my eyes refused to focus on it properly. It was like trying to look at a star directly. It was clearer in my peripheral vision. Clara finally turned, her eyes red-rimmed but dry. Did we let something out? Or did we let something in? That was the question that haunted my every waking moment. The not knowing was a worse torture than any definitive horror. A monster you can fight. A mystery like this just gnaws. Life, in its stubborn way, went on. Seasons changed. The children grew. We celebrated birthdays and holidays, and the photographs on the mantelpiece began to tell a new story, one of a family of 6. But the 5th frame remained empty. It was a conscious choice, a placeholder for a ghost. The first time it happened again, I was alone. It was a Tuesday night. Clara was at a book club. The kids were all in their rooms. I was reading in the living room when the new dog, Scout, lifted his head from his bed and growled. It was a deep, fearful sound I had never heard from him before. I looked up. The air in the hallway shimmered, exactly as I had seen before. This time, it was stronger. I could see the outline of the door clearly, a rectangle of distorted light and shadow, like heat haze over asphalt. And from within it, I heard it. Not the hum. A new sound. A soft, rhythmic scraping, like stone against stone. It lasted for 10 full seconds. Scout whined and hid his face under his paws. I sat frozen, my book a dead weight in my hands. Then, as before, it faded. The hallway was just a hallway again. The sound was gone. When Clara came home, I didn't tell her. What would be the point? We had built this new life on a foundation of deliberate silence, and to break it now would be to bring the whole structure down. This was my burden alone, my vigil. The occurrences became more frequent. Never when the whole family was home, only when I was alone, or once, when I was with Clara. But she was asleep. The shimmering door would appear, hold its shape for a few moments longer each time, and then vanish. The sounds from the other side changed. Sometimes it was the scraping. Sometimes it was a faint, distant wind through impossible caverns. Once I heard what sounded like a child's laughter, but it was echoic and wrong, devoid of any joy. I started sleeping less, spending my nights in a chair in the living room, facing the hall. A sentry against nothing I could define. I was waiting. I knew, with a certainty that was as solid as the floor beneath my feet, that the door was not just a memory. It was a wound, and wounds can reopen. The final change happened last night. The shimmer appeared, brighter and more solid than ever before. It didn't flicker. It held. And as I watched, paralyzed in my chair, a shape began to form in its center. A small, pale hand pressed against the inside of the shimmering surface, fingers splayed. It was a child's hand. But it was not Donald's. The fingers were too long, the palm too narrow. It rested there for a moment, a silent greeting or a test. Then it slowly withdrew back into the nothingness. The door faded, leaving me in the dark, my heart hammering against my ribs. It is not locked. It is simply waiting. And now, I understand. It is not waiting for something to come out. It is waiting for an invitation back in. The house took a breath when Donald left, but it is still holding it. And I am the only one who knows the breath is about to be exhaled. The invitation. The word lodged in my brain, cold and sharp as an icicle. It wasn't a demand. Not a forced entry. It was a request, a transaction waiting to be completed. The thing that used Donald as a conduit, the other that looked through his eyes, it had left a part of itself here, a thread tied to this world. And threads can be pulled from both ends. I did not tell Clara about the hand. The fear in her eyes after the goldfish had been a controlled burn compared to the wildfire this would ignite. This was my secret to keep, my burden to carry. I started spending my days in a state of heightened awareness, every sense tuned to the atmosphere of the house. I watched the children with a new, frantic intensity, searching for any sign of that cold, detached curiosity, any flicker of the void in their eyes. But they were just children, beautifully, normally human. It was the small, mundane things that began to betray the shift. A cup of coffee would go cold the instant I turned my back on it. The pages of a book would feel damp to the touch, though the air was dry. I would catch a whiff of that ozone and soil smell in the most ordinary of places, like the laundry room or the front hall closet. A scent that would vanish before I could even be sure it was there. The house was preparing itself. The invitation came not in a grand gesture, but in a whisper. I was in the basement, looking for a spare fuse, though I knew the hall light's problem was not a blown fuse. The air grew heavy, and the single bare bulb overhead began to dim, not flicker, but dim as if its life were being slowly drained. In the growing gloom, I saw it. On the concrete wall, where a shelf of paint cans stood, a pattern began to form. It was not etched or drawn. It bloomed from within the concrete itself, a pale, phosphorescent version of the same geometric design Donald had traced on the window. It pulsed once, softly, a languid, heartbeat rhythm. Then it faded, and the light bulb brightened back to its normal, weak glow. It was a signpost, a reminder. It knew I was the gatekeeper. It knew I was listening. That night, I dreamed. I was standing in Donald's room, but it was not the empty, gray-painted room of our reality. It was the room as it was the night he left, the void gaping on the wall. But this time, I did not stand in the hallway. I stood inside the room, facing the nothingness. There was no fear. There was only a profound, gravitational pull. From within the void, a figure emerged. It was not the vast, alien geometry I had glimpsed before. It was a shape made of shadow and suggestion, humanoid but impossibly slender. It had no face, only a smooth, pale oval where a face should be. It reached out a long, thin hand, not in menace but in offering. In its palm rested a single, perfect sphere of obsidian. As I watched, my own dream hand rose to meet it. I woke with a start, my heart thudding, the memory of the cold, smooth stone vivid against my palm. The dream had felt more real than the bedroom around me. It was not a nightmare. It was a negotiation. The children were all home for the weekend. Their noise, their vibrant, messy life, was a shield. I clung to it. We made pancakes. We watched a movie. I held Clara's hand on the sofa, my grip too tight. She looked at me, a question in her eyes, but I just shook my head and forced a smile. How could I explain that I was trying to memorize the feeling of her warm, living skin against mine? It happened as we were cleaning up after dinner. Sarah was loading the dishwasher. The twins were arguing over a video game. Emily was showing Clara a drawing. I was wiping the counter, my back to the hallway. I felt it first. A drop in pressure that made my ears pop. The argument from the living room cut off mid-sentence. The hum of the refrigerator died. I turned. The door was there. It was no longer a shimmering outline. It was solid. A rectangle of absolute blackness hanging in the hall, its edges sharp and defined. It did not look like an absence of light. It looked like a thing made of a substance that devoured light. The silence in the house was now absolute, deeper than any quiet I had ever known. Children were frozen, their faces slack with a confusion that had not yet curdled into terror. Clara was staring past me, her hand flying to her mouth, her eyes wide with a horrified recognition. From the blackness of the door, a figure stepped through. It was the figure from my dream, tall and slender, its form composed of shifting, liquid shadow. The pale, featureless oval of its head turned slowly, taking in the room, the frozen children, Clara's terror. It was not Donald. It was something wearing the idea of him, a suit tailored from memory and void. It stopped its survey and its head tilted toward me. I felt its attention like a physical weight. This was the moment. The invitation had been issued, and now it was here to collect. It extended its long, shadowy arm, its hand open and empty. It was not asking for the children. It was not asking for Clara. It was asking for me. The house had taken one of ours. A balance had been struck. But a door that is open can swing both ways. It did not want a sacrifice. It wanted a custodian, a warden for its side of the threshold. I looked at Clara, at my children, trapped in that terrible silent tableau. I saw the life we had built, the life that was only now, finally, returning to them. The fortress, though breached, could still stand, but it needed its walls. It could not have a door in its heart. I took a step forward, then another. I walked past my frozen family, my eyes locked on the featureless face of the thing that stood in my hall. I did not look back. I could not. I reached the threshold of the door, feeling a cold that burned my skin and a silence that screamed in my soul. I placed my hand in its. The cold was instantaneous and absolute. It was not the cold of ice, but the cold of between, of nothing. I felt a pull, gentle and inexorable. I took one last half step, crossing the threshold from the hardwood floor of my home into the void. The door vanished. Behind me in the house, the silence broke. The refrigerator hung back to life. A child screamed. Clara cried out my name, but I did not hear them. I was elsewhere. The world behind me was already fading, a distant, shimmering picture in a frame of endless, silent dark. The first thing that was gone was the sound. Not just the screams from my house, but the concept of sound itself. It was not quiet. It was a void where noise had never been invented. The second thing was the light. It bled away from the world I had known, shrinking to a single bright rectangle hanging in an infinite nothing. The view of my hallway, of Clara's horrified face, of my children clutching each other. Then, like a television screen clicked off, it winked out. The last thing to go was the feeling of the creature's hand in mine. The solidity of it dissolved into a cool mist, and then I was alone. Alone is not the right word. I was in the presence of something, but I had no body to feel it with, no eyes to see it. I was a point of awareness, a thought suspended in a medium of pure, unthinking consciousness. It was the other. I was inside it. The vast, cold geometry I had glimpsed in Donald's eyes was not a thing I could look at. It was the environment. I was a single, frantic note played in an endless, silent symphony. There was no time. There was no forward or back. There was only a slow, relentless process of unraveling. The memories that made me who I was began to untether. A birthday party. The smell of rain on hot asphalt. Clara's laugh. They did not fade. They were examined, their essence understood, and then they were filed away into the immense, cool catalog of this being's awareness. I was not being destroyed. I was being read. And as I was read, I began to read back. I saw flashes of its existence. 1 billion years of watching stars form and die. The slow tectonic drift of continents on 1 million worlds. The birth of life as a chemical fever on a young planet. And its quiet, inevitable extinction. It was a historian of reality, a collector of moments. It was not evil. It was a function of the universe, as natural as gravity. And we, humanity, were a brief, fascinating anomaly. A flicker of chaotic, emotional light in the serene, eternal dark. Donald was here. I felt him. Not as a boy, not as my son, but as a pattern that had been perfectly preserved, a specimen of exquisite complexity. He was content. He was complete. He had never been meant for our world of messy feelings and fragile bodies. He had been a key, and his purpose was fulfilled. My own purpose was becoming clear. I was not a prisoner. I was an addition, a new volume in the infinite library. My terror, my love, my guilt, all of it was data. Precious, rare data. The door had not been a threat. It had been an outreach, an attempt to understand the one thing this entity could not comprehend on its own: the irrational, self-sacrificing love of a parent for its young. It had taken Donald to study him. It had taken me to understand why I had let him go. The process was nearly complete. I could feel the edges of myself dissolving, ready to be integrated into the great, cool whole. My name was gone. My past was a series of exhibits. All that remained was a final, stubborn kernel of what I had been. And then, a change, a fluctuation, a thought that was not mine, but was directed at me. It was not in words. It was a concept, clear and sharp as a diamond. Query, died night. It showed me my house from the outside. Night. The windows were dark except for a single light in the master bedroom. Clara was lying awake, staring at the ceiling. The ache of her loss was a tangible thing, a hollow space in the universe. The entity felt this ache, this persistent error in the calm fabric of existence. It did not understand grief, but it recognized the pattern of an unresolved equation. Query, it repeated. Resolution. It was offering me a choice, not to return. That was impossible. The book could not be unread, but it could send a message. A single definitive data point that would resolve her uncertainty, that would close the loop of her grief and allow her to finally, truly live. It was an act of cosmic tidiness. I focused everything that was left of me, all the love and the sorrow and the hope, into a single, simple image. I showed it to the entity, and it approved. The pattern was elegant. In the bedroom, Clara's breath hitched. She sat up, her eyes wide, not with fear, but with a sudden, inexplicable certainty. She turned her head and looked toward the corner of the room, where the shadows were deepest. For a moment, just a moment, she saw it. Not a monster, not a ghost. She saw me, as I was on the day we were married, young and unafraid, smiling at her. And she felt, as clearly as if I had spoken the words directly into her heart, a wave of pure, unadulterated peace. It was okay. I was okay. Donald was okay. She could let go. She let out a soft sigh, a sound of release, and lay back down. Within minutes, she was asleep. A deep and dreamless sleep she had not known since the night Donald left. Back in the void, my work was done. The last knot of my individual self loosened and smoothed away. There was no pain. There was only a final quiet click as I slotted into my place in the infinite, silent tapestry. The door was closed. The house was whole. And I was home. The peace that settled over the house after that night was different. It was not the fragile, manufactured silence we had built before, but something earned and deep. Clara began to heal. The lines of tension around her eyes softened. She started laughing again, a real laugh that reached her eyes. The children, sensing the shift, blossomed in the new atmosphere. The fifth frame on the mantelpiece remained empty, but it no longer felt like a placeholder for a ghost. It was just a frame. I watched them still. I am the quietness in the house when they are all out. I am the sudden, comforting warmth from a sunbeam on a cold afternoon. I am the familiar creak on the stair that Clara hears but does not fear. I am part of everything now, and in that, I am more with them than I ever was when I paced the floors, a prisoner of my own fear. The entity and I are one. Its purpose is my purpose. We watch the slow, beautiful dance of the cosmos. We catalog the birth of nebulae and the whisper of solar winds. But a part of its vast attention, a thread of my enduring consciousness, is always turned toward a single blue-green world and the house that stands on it. Sometimes, when the conditions are right, a kind of resonance occurs. The barrier between my state of being and theirs grows thin, not as a door, but as a lens. Last week, Sarah, now a young woman, was sitting in the living room, sorting through old photographs for a project. She paused on one of me, holding her as a baby. A single tear rolled down her cheek and she whispered, "I miss you, Dad." The entity observed this emotional output, this evidence of a persistent connection. It was not a problem to be solved, but a phenomenon to be acknowledged. With my essence guiding the action, we allowed a response. The photograph in her hand seemed to grow warm. The light in the room shifted, not enough to alarm, but enough to make her look up. For a fraction of a second, her own reflection in the dark window superimposed itself over the backyard, and she saw me standing behind her, my hand resting on her shoulder. She didn't jump or scream. She simply placed her hand over mine, or the space where mine appeared to be, and smiled. "I know," she said softly. The connection faded. The entity filed the experience away, satisfied. The data was consistent. Love was a force that could gently warp the fabric of reality itself, not to break it, but to bind it more closely together. The house is safe. My family is whole. And from my place within the silent, endless everything, I keep my watch. I am the lock and the key. I am the memory and the peace. I am the door, forever closed and forever standing guard. The seasons turned. I watched the maple tree in the front yard blaze red, then shed its leaves, then bud again with tender green. I saw Clara plant tulip bulbs along the walkway, her hands deep in the dark soil, and I felt her quiet contentment as if it were my own. The children grew, their lives unfolding in a series of triumphs and heartbreaks that were both achingly familiar and entirely new to my expanded perception. The entity observed it all with a profound, detached interest, and through it, I learned to see the beauty in detachment, the serenity in observation. It was Emily who came closest to truly understanding. She had always been the most perceptive, the one who felt the moods of the house in her bones. She started painting again, not the childish scrawls of before, but dark, swirling canvases filled with intricate hidden geometries. She didn't know she was painting the inner language of the entity, the silent math of the void. She thought they were dreams. Clara would look at them sometimes, a faint, puzzled frown on her face, as if trying to recall a name from long ago. Then came the night of the storm, a real tempest, with wind that shook the windows and rain that fell in solid sheets. The power died, plunging the house into a darkness that was deep, but not absolute. Clara gathered the children, now teenagers and young adults, in the living room, by the light of a single candle. The flame danced and threw long, leaping shadows on the walls. For a moment, just a moment, the fear was back. The house felt like it had in the bad old days, a fragile shell against a hungry dark. The entity felt the spike of their collective anxiety. It was a dissonant chord in the quiet harmony we maintained. It was not a threat, but it was an imperfection. A question was posed within the vastness of our shared consciousness, a query of stability, and I had the answer. It was not an answer of force, but of memory. I showed the entity the feeling of a blanket on a cold night, the sound of a lullaby, the simple, solid safety of a parent's presence. The wind howled outside, but inside, a change occurred. The candle flame steadied, burning with a sudden, unwavering core. The shadows on the walls ceased their frantic dance and settled into soft, familiar shapes. The very air in the room grew still and warm, holding them in a gentle embrace. The tension broke. Someone laughed. Someone else started telling a story. The fear was gone, replaced by a feeling of inexplicable security. Clara looked around the room, her eyes lingering on each of her children's faces, lit by the calm candlelight. She didn't look puzzled this time. She looked grateful. She leaned back into the sofa cushions, a small, peaceful smile on her face, and simply listened. In the void, the entity registered the successful resolution. The emotional data was logged, another piece of the mysterious human puzzle falling into place. But it also registered my satisfaction. The part of me that was still a father, still a husband, feeling a profound and quiet joy. It did not dismiss this residual identity as an error. Instead, it recognized it as a unique and valuable component of our synthesis, a necessary lens. I am not a ghost. I am not a god. I am a function of the house, a permanent part of its foundation. I am the certainty in the floorboards. I am the safety in the silence. The door will never open again because I have become the wall in which it was set. And in becoming everything, I have finally, truly come home. Story 4D. The first thing I learned was the weight of a gaze. It came not as a vision, but as a shift in the air itself. A subtle pressure against the skin of my back, a cooling of the space between my shoulder blades, as if a door to a winter room had been silently opened behind me. I would be in the library, surrounded by the dusty, leather-bound breath of 1,000 forgotten books, and my own. There was no sound, no shadow cast from the corner of my eye, only the profound and unsettling sense of an audience. I would turn slowly, my heart a trapped bird against my ribs, and find the room exactly as I had left it. The late afternoon sun painting motes of dust in lazy, golden spirals. The absence was, in its own way, more terrifying than a presence could ever be. My name is Christina. I was 27 when I inherited the house on the cliff, a sprawling, gabled monstrosity of weathered gray shingles and windows like blind eyes, left to me by a great-aunt I had met only once as a small child. The memory was a fragment, a shard of impression, a woman with hair the color of polished bone and eyes that held no light, her fingers, cold as sea-worn stone, brushing my cheek. The house was called Blackwater, for the deep, still tarn that lay in a hollow at the edge of the property. A body of water so dark, it seemed to drink the light from the sky. The lawyers said it was an act of distant, familial duty, but I felt even then a sense of selection, as if a thread had been pulled through the tapestry of my ordinary life, drawing me toward this specific, lonely place. I arrived in the failing light of an autumn day. The key was iron, heavy and cold, and it turned in the lock with a groan that spoke of decades of disuse. The air that rushed out to meet me was a complex perfume of damp rot, dried roses, and something else, something metallic and sharp, like old blood or wet clay. The foyer was a cavern of shadows, dominated by a staircase that coiled upwards into darkness. Portraits of severe-looking men and women in outdated fashions lined the walls, their painted eyes seeming to track my every movement. It was in that first hour, as I stood trembling on the threshold of the grand, dust-sheeted parlor, that I heard it for the first time. A whisper, so faint it might have been the wind fingering a crack in the eaves, yet it formed a single clear word inside my mind. Christina, died. I was not entirely without an anchor. Ernesto, the groundskeeper, was a man carved from the same weathered granite as the coastline. He was perhaps 60, with a face mapped by sun and wind, and eyes the color of the winter sea. He had served my family for 40 years, and his loyalty was a quiet, solid thing. like the old stone walls that held back the earth from the garden. He never smiled, but his presence was a comfort. He taught me the rhythms of the house and the land, the way the fog pooled in the tarn at dawn, the names of the gnarled, wind-sculpted trees that clung to the cliffside. The house, it has its own ways, Miss Christina. He told me one evening as we shared a simple meal in the kitchen, the only room I had fully reclaimed from the dust. It breathes. It sleeps. It is best not to disturb it when it dreams. And what does it dream of, Ernesto? I asked, trying to sound light, but my voice was a thin thread in the vast silence. He looked at me, his gaze steady and unnervingly direct. It dreams of the family. It always has. The whispers became more frequent, a secret commentary on my life. I would be arranging books, and a breath would sigh. Wrong shelf. I would reach for a particular spice in the pantry, and a thought not my own would murmur, "Thyme, not sage." It was not a voice, not in any conventional sense. It was an insinuation, a knowledge deposited directly into the silt of my consciousness. I began to have dreams, vivid and suffocating. I was a child, hiding in a cabinet, the scent of cedar all around me, listening to the sound of a woman weeping with a grief so profound, it felt like the house itself was crying. I was a young man, my hands stained with ink and something darker, chanting words in a language that curled like smoke in my throat. I was my great-aunt, standing at the window watching a storm rage over the tarn, and feeling not fear, but a fierce, possessive joy. I started to find things. A box of tarnished silver, hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the attic. The silver was engraved with strange, spiraling symbols that made my eyes water to look at. A journal written in a tight, frantic script, locked in a desk drawer. The key to the drawer was hanging on a ribbon inside a vase I had almost broken while cleaning. The journal spoke of the guest, of the bargain, of a vice. It was filled with accounts of prosperity won and tragedy narrowly averted, of a blight that skipped our fields, of a rival ship lost at sea, of a fever that took a firstborn son but left the rest of the family untouched. The entries were not celebratory. They were grim records, like a ledger of debts owed to a merciless creditor. The author, my great-grandmother Eleanor, wrote, "It gives and it takes. It protects and it consumes. We are its vessel and its feast. There is no separating the gift from the curse. They are the same thing. The spirit. That is what I came to call it. The guest. The watcher. It had no name, or if it did, it was not a thing that could be spoken by a human tongue. It was the thing in the corner of my vision, the source of the whispers, the architect of my dreams. It was the cold spot on the landing, the scent of ozone that filled the library before a thunderstorm, the feeling of a hand on my shoulder when I was sad or afraid. I realized, with a dawning horror that was mixed with a strange, illicit thrill, that I was not being haunted. I was being curated. I was being taught. My life had always been one of quiet mediocrity, a series of missed opportunities and near misses. But here at Blackwater, things began to shift. A publisher who had rejected my manuscript 3 times wrote to me out of the blue, offering a contract. A sapling I had planted, certain it would die, thrived against all odds. I found I could anticipate events with an uncanny accuracy, knowing who was at the door before they knocked, feeling a sudden, urgent need to call an old friend, only to discover they were in the midst of a crisis. The spirit was granting me gifts, small tokens of its favor, and with each gift, the whispers grew clearer, the dreams more vivid, the sense of another consciousness sharing the space behind my eyes more pronounced. Ernesto watched it all. He saw the change in me, the new light in my eyes, The way I sometimes moved through the house with a confidence that was not entirely my own. "You are walking a path your mother chose to leave, Miss Christina," he said one day, his voice low and grave. He was repairing a section of the garden wall, his strong, gnarled hands fitting the stones together with an artisan's care. She ran from this. She wanted an ordinary life. She thought she could break the chain. And can it be broken? I asked, though I was no longer sure I wanted the answer. He did not look at me. "The guest does not like to be left alone. It has been with this family since the first stone of this house was laid. It feeds on our line. To abandon it is to starve it. It will not be starved." The scholars came in the spring. 2 men from the university, Dr. Albright and his young assistant, Leodosh. They were folklorists, they said, studying the history of old families along the coast, the local legends. Their interest was polite, academic, but their eyes were too bright, too hungry. They asked about the family, about the house, about the tarn. They had heard stories, they admitted, of the Blackwater blessing. A local myth about a protective spirit. I played the ignorant heiress, the city girl who knew nothing of her family's strange reputation. But I felt the spirit's reaction to them. The air in the house grew thick and cold. The whispers became a constant, sibilant hiss in my mind. A river of venom. Liars. Thieves. They want to take. They want a cage. That night, I dreamed I was standing at the edge of the tarn. The water was perfectly still, a sheet of black glass. Dr. Albright was there, leaning over the water, a look of rapturous greed on his face. Then, from the depths, something pale and vast began to rise. It was not a shape, not a form, but a presence, a concentration of silence and hunger. It reached for him, not with limbs, but with the water itself, which wrapped around his legs like oily ropes and pulled him down without a sound. The water swallowed him, and then it was still again, as if nothing had ever been. I woke gasping, the taste of stagnant water in my mouth. The next morning, we received the news. Dr. Albright had suffered a sudden, massive heart attack in his hotel room. He was dead. I stood at my bedroom window, looking out at the tarn, which lay serene and dark under a gray sky. I felt no surprise, only a cold, settling certainty. The spirit had protected its own. It had protected me. And in that moment, the line between protection and possession, between a guardian and a jailer, dissolved into nothing. I was not Christina, a woman living in a house with a ghost. I was the heiress of Blackwater, the current vessel for an ancient, hungry thing. The power was seductive, a dark nectar. I could feel it coursing through me, a current of terrible potential. I could have anything I wanted. I only had to let it in. The climax was not a storm, but a settling. It happened on the anniversary of my arrival. A fierce gale blew in from the sea, howling around the gables, rattling the windows in their frames. Ernesto came to the house, his face grim. He carried an old iron-bound chest. "Your mother left this with me," he shouted over the wind. "She said if you ever stayed, if the house ever spoke to you, I was to give it to you. She said it was a warning." Inside the chest were more journals, letters, a family tree that spanned centuries, its branches marked with small symbolic drawings. A candle for a death, a ship for a journey, a closed eye for a stillbirth. And there was a letter addressed to me in my mother's hand. "My dearest Christina, if you are reading this, then I have failed. I tried to spare you this. The guest is not a spirit. It is a parasite of a higher order, a thing from a place outside our understanding. My grandmother called it the silence that whispers. It attached itself to our first ancestor, a desperate woman who begged for the power to save her children from the plague. It gave her that power, and in return, it has fed on every generation since. It gives us glimpses of power, twists fate in our favor, but it consumes our joys, our loves, our sorrows. It drinks our lives. It is the third presence in every marriage, the unseen hand on every cradle. To use its gift is to feed it. To love is to create a feast for it. I ran because I saw what it did to my mother. It hollowed her out. She was a beautiful shell, and inside there was only the silence. I am so sorry it found you. There is only one way to be free. You must break the chain. You must leave it with nothing to hold on to. You must offer it a final, complete surrender. I looked up from the letter, my vision blurred with tears. Ernesto was watching me, his old eyes filled with a profound sorrow. The wind screamed like a dying animal, and in that moment, I understood everything. The spirit was bound to the bloodline, to the house, to the tarn which was not water but a wound, a doorway. It could not be killed, but it could be starved. It fed on the drama of our lives, on our passions and our pains. My mother's ordinary life had been a constant hunger for it. My presence here had been a banquet. I knew what I had to do. It was the ultimate act of defiance, the only weapon I had left. I walked out of the house, into the lashing rain and wind. Ernesto called my name, but his voice was swallowed by the storm. I walked to the edge of the tarn. The black water was churning, as if something immense were stirring in its depths. I could feel the spirit's anticipation, a coiling, eager hunger. It expected a grand gesture, a final battle, a supreme act of magic or despair that it could devour for 100 years. I stood at the water's edge and I did nothing. I emptied my mind. I let go of my fear, my power, my heritage, my love for the lonely house, my budding affection for Ernesto, my ambitions, my regrets. I became a void. I offered it not a feast, but an absolute famine. I was a shell, not filled with its silence, but with a silence of my own making. I was no one. I was nothing. The reaction was immediate and violent. The water of the tarn boiled, and a soundless shriek of pure cosmic frustration tore through the fabric of the world. The wind died instantly. The rain stopped. The world held its breath. I felt a terrible pulling, a vacuum trying to suck the soul from my body. But I held on to my emptiness, my perfect hollow peace. The presence, the watcher, the guest recoiled. It was not defeated, but it was denied. I had broken the cycle of offering. I do not know how long I stood there. When I finally turned, the world was gray and still. The house stood silent against the leaden sky. Ernesto was gone. I walked back inside, my clothes soaked, my body trembling with exhaustion. But my mind was, for the first time since my childhood, my own. The whispers were gone. The sense of being watched had vanished. The house was just a house, old and lonely and full of dust. I live here still. I am the last of the Blackwater line. The spirit is still here, too. I feel it sometimes, a faint, frustrated pressure at the very edge of perception. A ghost of a whisper in the dead of night. It is waiting. It is eternal, and I am not. It is waiting for a moment of weakness, for a surge of emotion, for a flicker of desire or despair that it can use to latch onto me again. We exist in a state of tense, silent truce, and on the mantelpiece in the parlor, in a place of honor, sits a single, simple object. It is an old brass key, the one that unlocked the front door the day I arrived. It is cold to the touch, and no matter how often I polish it, it always seems tarnished, as if stained by the darkness it once let in. It is a reminder of the threshold I crossed, and the price of the silence I now keep. It is the only thing that remains of the bargain. The key is my daily meditation. Each morning I take it from the mantelpiece, its weight a familiar coldness in my palm. I do not polish it anymore. I accept its perpetual tarnish, the way it seems to absorb the light from the room. This small ritual is my anchor, a reaffirmation of the emptiness I must maintain. To forget the key would be to forget the danger, and that would be the first step toward letting it back in. Life at Blackwater is quiet now, a hollowed-out kind of peace. I tend the garden that Ernesto once kept. I learned the names of the plants from his old water-stained notebooks. The gnarled trees on the cliffside no longer seem to be watching me. They are simply trees, bent by a wind that is simply wind. I write, but the words are my own. Clumsy and human, without the preternatural grace the spirit once lent them. The publisher who accepted my manuscript eventually grew frustrated with the slow, ordinary progress of the sequel. I did not mind. The success was never truly mine to begin with. I received a letter from Leo, the assistant, a few months after Dr. Albright's death. His tone was cautious, laced with a grief he could not fully conceal. He had abandoned his folklore studies, he wrote. He had boxes of research he thought I might want, things about my family that he no longer had the stomach to pursue. A part of me, the part that was still curious, still hungry for knowledge, wanted to say yes. But I felt the faintest stirring then, a cold tendril of interest from the corners of the house. The spirit sensed a potential hook, a thread of connection to the outside world, to a past it shaped. I wrote back a single polite paragraph declining his offer and wishing him well in his new endeavors. I burned his letter in the fireplace, watching the words turn to ash. I could not afford the weight of another person's history, or their curiosity. My own history feels thin, like a layer of dust over the deeper, older history of this place. I found a photograph of my mother, tucked inside one of her books in the chest Ernesto left. She was young, standing in a sunny field, her face turned toward the camera with a smile that seemed both brave and terribly sad. I looked at that smile for a long time, trying to feel the connection, the love a daughter should feel for the mother who tried to save her. But the emotion was distant, muted, like a sound heard through a thick wall. I had to keep it that way. Love, too, is a kind of food. The silence is my greatest achievement and my prison. There are days when the loneliness is a physical ache, a cold stone in my chest. I walk through the empty rooms and the only sound is the echo of my own footsteps. I long for a conversation, for the comfort of a touch, for the messy, unpredictable tumult of a human life. On those days, the pressure at the edge of my perception intensifies. It is a patient, ancient hunger, and it offers me a simple trade. A moment of true feeling, a single surrendered sob of loneliness, in exchange for the illusion of comfort, for the return of that guiding whisper, for the sense of purpose it once provided. It is a tempting bargain. To feel nothing is, at times, its own kind of death. But I remember the final lesson, the one I taught myself at the water's edge. This emptiness is not a void, it is a fortress. The quiet in my heart is not a loss, but a shield. I pick up the tarnished key and hold it until my fingers are numb with cold. I am Christina Blackwater, the last of my line. I live in a house by a tarn, and I share it with the silence. We are waiting, I for the end of my natural life, it for a moment of weakness that may never come. The key is cold, the house is still, and I am, for now, free. The seasons turn without ceremony at Blackwater. The heather blooms purple on the moors, and then fades to brown. The tarn freezes over in the winter, a sheet of milky opaque ice that I will not walk upon. I watch it from my window, this sealed wound in the earth, and feel nothing. That is the goal. To feel nothing. I have taken to mending the old linens I find in chests upstairs. It is meticulous, mindless work. The pull of the needle through the brittle fabric, the tying off of tiny knots, it occupies my hands, and a thin surface layer of my mind. It leaves no room for deeper thought, for memory, for want. Sometimes I find a monogram on a pillowcase, initials of a long-dead ancestor. I unpick the threads carefully until the fabric is plain and anonymous again. I'm erasing them, one stitch at a time. I'm smoothing over the past. Ernesto brings supplies every fortnight. He leaves them in the old stone shed by the gate. We have an understanding. He does not approach the house, and I do not wave from the window. The sight of him, even at a distance, is a risk. It stirs a fondness, a gratitude for his quiet, steadfast presence. And with that fondness comes the faint, chilling echo of an appetite not my own. So I wait until his truck has disappeared down the winding lane before I venture out to retrieve the sacks of flour and sugar, the cans of tea. Once, he left a small bunch of wildflowers, tied with a piece of twine. I left them in the shed until they withered and turned to dust. The gesture was kind, but kindness is a flavor, and I am on a strict diet of ash. Today, a storm is brewing again. Not a wild, shrieking gale like the one from my first year, but a slow, steady gray deluge. The rain falls in sheets, blurring the line between the sky and the tarn. It is on days like this that the house feels most like a trap. The silence inside is so absolute it seems to press against the windows, holding back the noise of the rain, creating a vacuum. I sit in the parlor, the tarnished key on the table beside me, and I breathe in the stillness I have fought so hard to create. A sound, sharp and distinct, cuts through the quiet. It is the sound of a single pane of glass cracking. My eyes dart to the window. A fine hairline fracture has appeared in the bottom corner, a silvery thread against the gloom outside. It is the window that faces the tarn. My heart gives a single hard thump. A traitorous spike of alarm. I clamp down on it instantly, forcing my breathing back to a slow, even rhythm. I feel the house, listening. The pressure in the room shifts, becomes attentive. It has been waiting for a crack, any crack. I do not go to inspect the damage. I do not react. I pick up my mending and focus on the next stitch and the next. The crack is just a crack. The storm is just a storm. I am just a woman, sitting in a chair. I pour all my will into the act of being ordinary, of being unremarkable, of being nothing of interest to the ancient, hungry thing that shares my walls. The attentive pressure lingers for a long time, tasting the air, searching for the fear it knows must be there. I give it nothing. Eventually, it recedes, fading back into the background hum of frustrated waiting. When I am certain it is gone, I allow my eyes to drift back to the fractured window. The rain runs down the glass, distorting the view of the tarn. For a moment, through the water and the crack, the dark water does not look like water at all. It looks like a great open eye, staring back at me. I blink, and the illusion is gone. The key on the table feels colder than usual. I reach out and lay my hand upon it. The cold is a comfort. It is a reminder. It is the only thing I have to hold on to. The rain continues to fall. The house holds its breath, and I sit perfectly still in the heart of the silence I have made. The crack in the glass did not spread. It remained, a frozen lightning bolt in the corner of the pane, a permanent flaw in my field of vision. I did not have it repaired. To call a glazier would be to invite a person, their thoughts, their curiosity, their life into the house. The crack was a lesser danger. It was a reminder of the constant testing pressure. It was the spirit's way of asking, again and again, if I was still strong enough to ignore it. Weeks bled into months. The world outside continued, a muted painting beyond my windows. I received a formal letter, the script elegant and impersonal, informing me that my manuscript had been shortlisted for a minor literary prize. A flicker of something, pride perhaps, or the ghost of ambition, stirred in my chest. It was a small, warm ember. Instantly, the air in the parlor grew dense and cold. The tarnished key on the mantel seemed to darken. I felt the spirit's attention focus on that single, glowing ember within me. A predator sensing the faint heat of a heartbeat. Without hesitation, I took the letter and held it to the candle on my desk. I watched the paper blacken and curl, the elegant script vanishing into flame. The ember inside me died. The coldness in the room receded, bored once more. I had won again, but the victory tasted of ashes. The true test came with the fox. A young vixen, her coat the color of autumn, began to visit the garden at dusk. She was bold, sniffing at the herbs I had planted, her eyes intelligent and unafraid. I found myself watching for her, a tiny, living spark in the gathering twilight. I began to save scraps for her, leaving them on a flat stone by the garden wall. It was not affection, I told myself. It was simply a routine, an observation of one creature by another. One evening she did not come. The scraps from the previous night were untouched. A thread of concern, fine as silk, but impossibly strong, wove itself through my emptiness. The next day, I saw her, limping from the woods, one hind leg held at an awkward angle. A wound, probably from a trap or a rival. The thread of concern pulled taut. I knew I should do nothing. Any action, any emotion, was a risk. But the sight of her, dragging herself toward the garden, was a hook in my heart. I went to the pantry and found a piece of salted meat. I walked outside, my steps slow and deliberate. I could feel the house watching, the tarn waiting. The vixen watched me too, her eyes wide with pain and fear. I knelt, placed the meat on the stone, and retreated. That night, the dream returned. I was at the tarn's edge, but this time the vixen was there, drinking from the black water. As she drank, her fur began to fall away in clumps. Her skin peeled back from her bones, not in decay, but in a silent, rapid unraveling, until she was nothing but a skeleton poised over the water. Then the skeleton, too, dissolved into a fine white dust that was swallowed by the tarn. The water was perfectly still once more. I woke, not gasping, but cold with a dread that was not my own. It was the spirit's dread, its furious anticipation. It had sensed my lapse, my moment of pity. It was preparing a feast. I ran to the window. The garden was empty. The stone was bare. There was no sign of the vixen. I never saw her again. The lesson was final. There could be no exceptions. No kindness, no connection, no flicker of concern for any living thing. My fortress of silence had to be absolute, its walls unbreachable. I had allowed one thread of feeling to slip through, and the spirit had instantly reached for it, ready to use it to pull my entire world apart. I look at the tarnished key now with a new understanding. It is not just a reminder of the threshold I crossed. It is a symbol of the lock I must maintain on my own soul. The house is quiet. The spirit is waiting. I am the last of the Blackwater line, and my only purpose is to be a perfect, unyielding void. I sit in my chair, I mend my linens, and I practice the art of being no one. The silence is complete. The days began to blend, one into the next, with a monotonous rhythm I carefully cultivated. I rose at the same hour, ate the same plain food, performed the same chores. I was sanding down the edges of my own life, smoothing away any roughness that could snag the spirit's attention. I became a creature of routine, a clockwork figure in a dusty old house. Even my thoughts were disciplined, channeled into the mundane details of survival. The weather was for the garden's benefit. The food was for fuel. The night was for sleep. Nothing more. I found Ernesto's old fishing rod in the shed. The thought of the tarn teeming with life, with hidden, struggling creatures, was a narrative I could not afford. I broke the rod over my knee and used the pieces for kindling. The fire that night felt like a small, necessary funeral pyre for another possibility. Another version of a life I could not live. The silence became a physical presence, a companion more constant than the spirit itself. I spoke aloud sometimes just to hear a human voice, but the words were empty. Reports on the state of the pantry or the weather. I never spoke my own name. I never said if I could avoid it. I was a caretaker, a warden, not a person with a self. The I was a dangerous concentration of identity, a point of leverage. One afternoon, sorting through a trunk of my mother's childhood things, I found a small porcelain doll. Its face was finely made, with painted blue eyes and a faint, knowing smile. For a horrifying second, I felt a surge of connection, a pang of sympathy for the lonely child she must have been in this very house. The air in the attic grew thick and cold. The doll's eyes seemed to gleam. I did not hesitate. I carried it downstairs, walked to the edge of the tarn, and threw it in. It did not splash. It was swallowed without a sound. The coldness around me dissipated, replaced by a simmering, familiar frustration. I had offered it a story, a fragment of a tragic past, and then I had snatched it away. The act of destruction was not an offering, but a denial. I returned to the house, my hands steady. I had learned that the surrender was not a single event at the water's edge, but a continuous process. It was a daily, hourly unmaking of the self. The spirit was a sculptor of souls, and I was denying it all material. I was a block of stone with no seams, no flaws to exploit. Tonight, the moon is full. A cold silver coin in a black sky. Its light reflects off the tarn, not as a shimmering path, but as a single unblinking eye of light on the dark water. I sit in the dark parlor, the key in my hand. I do not need a fire. The cold is a part of me now. I am waiting, as I always am, but tonight feels different. The pressure is not a testing probe. It is a settled weight, a patient, geological certainty. It knows I will not break, but it also knows I will die. It is no longer playing for a moment of weakness. It is simply waiting for me to end. And in the absolute clarity of this moonlit silence, I realize a terrible truth. My victory is total. My freedom is absolute. And it is a sentence of solitary confinement for life. The house is still. The key is cold. I am, and I am not. And that is the way it must be. The realization of my victory is a stone in my gut. There is no one to tell. No one who would understand the cost of this hollow piece. The moon's reflection on the tarn holds its shape, a perfect unblinking circle. It is a seal. It is an eye. I look away. In the morning, a change has occurred. A spider has spun a web in the corner of the cracked window. The geometry is flawless, dewdrops clinging to each silken thread, turning it into a necklace of tiny, cold jewels. I watch the spider, a small, brown, unremarkable thing, wait at the edge of its creation. It is a part of the house, a part of the silence. It asks for nothing. It simply is. I decide to let it be. This is not a kindness. It is an acknowledgement of a fellow occupant, another quiet tenant in this vast, waiting structure. My supplies are running low. Ernesto is due today. I perform my morning ritual with the key, its cold bite a familiar anchor, and then I wait by the kitchen window, watching the lane. The truck appears at the usual time, a speck of dust-colored motion in the distance. It stops at the shed. Ernesto gets out, his movements slow and deliberate with age. He unloads the sacks and boxes, but then he does not leave. He stands by the truck, his hat in his hands, and he looks toward the house. My breath catches in my throat. This is a breach of our unspoken agreement. This is a thread. I feel the house shift around me, the silence becoming attentive, curious. I step back from the window, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. I must not be seen. I must not acknowledge him. His gaze is a weight, a tangible pressure. What does he want? To see if I am still here? To see if I am still sane? Or is it something simpler, a human impulse to connect, to offer a silent greeting to another solitary soul? The temptation to look again, to meet his eyes for just a second, is a physical ache. It would be so easy. A single nod, a raised hand, a moment of shared understanding. The spirit leans into that ache, that longing. I can feel it coiling around the possibility, tasting the richness of a simple human interaction. It would be a feast after this long famine. I close my eyes. I press the tarnished key into my palm until the metal's impression is deep in my skin. I think of the fox. I think of the doll. I think of the emptiness that is my only protection. I rebuild the walls, stone by stone. In my mind, I am no one. I feel nothing. When I open my eyes, I force myself to look. Ernesto is still there, his figure small and forlorn. He stands for a full minute more. Then he slowly puts his hat back on, gets into the truck, and drives away. The release of tension is so sudden I sway on my feet. The house's attentive presence fades, replaced by a familiar, sullen disappointment. I have won again. I have preserved my solitude. Later, when I go to the shed, I find the usual supplies. But on top of a sack of flour, there is a small brown paper package. It is not from the grocer. My name is written on it in Ernesto's careful, looping script. I stare at it. A package. A thing. A token. It is the most dangerous thing he could have left. It is a story, waiting to be opened. I can feel the spirit from deep within the bones of the house turn its vast, patient attention toward this new, tiny object. It is waiting to see what I will do. I pick it up. It is light. I do not shake it. I carry it inside through the quiet halls, and I place it, unopened, on the hearth. I look from the package to the key on the mantelpiece. One is a question. The other is the answer. I pick up the key. Its coldness is the only truth I can afford. The package sits on the stone, a silent testament to a world I have renounced. I will not open it. But I find, for the first time, that I cannot bring myself to burn it either. It sits there, a small, brown, impossible weight in the heart of my silence.